The machine had been dead for 61 hours, a $5 million piece of equipment, 3 engineering teams. The actual manufacturer flown in from Germany, and not one single person could figure out what was wrong. The $140 million contract, the one that would either save Hartwell Advanced Manufacturing or bury it, was 43 days away. Then a maintenance worker in a dirty uniform walked out of the shadows and said, "Can I take a look?" And a billionaire CEO nearly had him thrown out of the building. She almost made the worst mistake of her life. If a story like this deserves to be heard, hit that subscribe button right now, because every week I bring you stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things that the world almost missed entirely. And before you go anywhere, drop a comment below and tell me the city and country where you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Hit that like button too. Now let's go back to where it all began. It happened on a Tuesday. Not during the day shift, when supervisors were walking the floor and the executive offices upstairs were full of people paid to look like they had answers. It happened at 11:47 p.m., during the dead hours, when the skeleton crew kept the machines breathing and the rest of the world was asleep. The sound came first. Later, the workers who were there that night would describe it differently depending on who you asked. Marcus Webb, the senior floor operator who'd been running production lines for 22 years, said it sounded like a giant exhaling, one long mechanical breath that simply didn't come back in. Dottie Pierce, the line quality checker who'd been sitting with her logbook 30 feet away, said it was more like a piano going suddenly, completely silent in the middle of a song. The kind of silence that's louder than noise. The Hartwell Series 7 industrial fabrication system, all 14 feet and 5,200 pounds of it, just stopped. No warning light, no error code on the primary screen, no smoke, no smell, no obvious catastrophe. One moment it was doing what it had been doing for the past 6 hours, running a precision fabrication sequence on aerospace-grade titanium components worth roughly $40,000 per batch. The next moment, it was nothing but a very expensive piece of dark metal taking up a third of the production floor. Marcus hit the emergency stop. Already stopped. He ran through the restart protocol. Nothing. He called his supervisor, Phil Garrett, who called his supervisor, Danny Ochoa, who called the plant manager, Ron Stiles, who called the on-site engineering team, who had been home asleep, who were now very unhappy. By 1 a.m., there were 11 people standing around a dead machine. By 3 a.m., there were 19. By 6 a.m. the next morning, when the day shift arrived and found the entire production floor at a standstill, Ron Stiles had already placed 2 phone calls that he was not looking forward to making. The first was to the manufacturer's regional technical support team in Columbus, Ohio. The second was to the executive floor, to Ava Sterling. Ava Sterling had not planned to spend her Tuesday morning driving to the factory at 6:45 a.m. in last night's clothes. She'd been at a dinner in the city, a fundraiser for a children's hospital, which she genuinely cared about, not the kind of thing her PR team scheduled to make her look good. She'd gotten back to her apartment at midnight, set her alarm for 5:30, and had been staring at the ceiling for 20 minutes when her phone rang. Ron Stiles' name on the screen at 12:23 a.m. was never good news. She listened. She asked 3 questions. She hung up and lay back on her pillow and stared at the ceiling for another 4 minutes, doing the math she already knew. The Series 7 was the only machine on their floor capable of running the titanium component sequence required for the Meridian Aerospace contract. The Meridian inspection was in 43 days. The contract itself, $140 million over 5 years, the kind of deal that would either define Hartwell's next decade or confirm that the company had peaked, depended entirely on demonstrating full production capacity during that inspection. If the machine was down for a week, they could recover. If it was down for 2 weeks, it would be tight. If it was down for longer than that, Ava Sterling was going to be sitting across from a room full of Meridian executives explaining why a company that had just promised aerospace-grade reliability couldn't keep its own primary equipment running. She got up, got dressed, made coffee she didn't drink, and drove to the factory. Ava was 30 years old, which still surprised people when they found out. She'd taken over Hartwell 3 years ago, when her father, James Sterling, stepped back from day-to-day operations after a health scare that the family had handled quietly and without public drama. James had built the company from a regional parts supplier into a mid-tier advanced manufacturing firm with 340 employees and a solid regional reputation. Ava had spent the first year learning every corner of the operation, the second year making painful changes that made her unpopular, and the third year starting to see the results of those changes. Hartwell was growing, cautiously, not spectacularly, but steadily, which was the kind of growth that actually lasted. The Meridian contract was supposed to be the moment when steady became significant. Now she was walking onto a production floor that smelled like machine oil and anxiety, and the look on Ron Stiles' face when he saw her told her that the situation was worse than the phone call had suggested. "How bad?" she said without hello. Ron was 54, heavy-set, with the permanent expression of a man who'd been putting out fires for 3 decades and had run out of ways to act calm about it. "Bad," he said. "That's not a number, Ron. Our internal team has been at it since midnight. I've had the regional tech support on the phone since 2. They're telling me they've never seen a diagnostic come back this clean on a machine that isn't running. It's not throwing a single error code." Ava looked at the machine. In the harsh fluorescent light of the production floor, it looked almost peaceful, like something sleeping that had no intention of waking up. "What does that mean?" "It means the machine's computer thinks everything is fine. But everything is not fine. No, everything is very much not fine." She folded her arms. "Get me the manufacturer on site. Not on the phone. I want a human being who actually built this thing standing in front of it by tomorrow morning." The next 36 hours were, depending on your position in the Hartwell organizational chart, either a masterclass in problem solving or a masterclass in collective humiliation. Hartwell's own engineering team. 7 people, all credentialed, all experienced, worked through the first night and found nothing. They ran every diagnostic the system's software supported. They checked the power supply, the hydraulic lines, the primary circuit boards. They pulled and reseated every connection they could access. The machine passed every test and refused to start. By Wednesday afternoon, Ava had authorized bringing in an outside engineering firm, Precision Dynamic Systems, out of Cincinnati, which charged $380 an hour and had a reputation for solving problems that stumped in-house teams. 4 of their engineers arrived by evening, spent 6 hours on the machine, and presented Ava with a report at midnight that was 12 pages long and reached essentially the same conclusion. The machine's diagnostic systems showed no fault. They had no explanation for why it wasn't running. The manufacturer's technical specialist, a methodical German engineer named Klaus Bauer, who had flown from their North American headquarters in Toronto, arrived Thursday morning and spent most of the day working through a manufacturer-level diagnostic process that wasn't available to outside technicians. He had access to the machine's raw firmware logs, its complete service history, its factory calibration data. At 4:30 p.m. on Thursday, Klaus Bauer sat down across from Ava Sterling in the conference room adjacent to the production floor, folded his hands on the table, and said very carefully, "Ms. Sterling, I have worked on Series 7 systems for 9 years. I have never seen a failure present this way. The machine's own systems do not believe there is a malfunction. I cannot repair a fault. I cannot locate." Ava looked at him for a long moment. "So you're telling me," she said, "that you flew from Toronto to tell me you don't know what's wrong?" Klaus did not flinch. He was the kind of man who'd been in enough hard rooms to have learned not to flinch. "I'm telling you that the diagnostic pathway I have available to me has been exhausted. There may be a physical fault at the component level that the monitoring systems cannot detect, but finding that would require essentially disassembling a significant portion of the machine, which would take weeks and would void certain warranty provisions." Silence. "Weeks," Ava repeated. "Potentially." She stood up, thanked him in a tone that suggested she was not particularly grateful, and walked back out onto the production floor where the dead machine sat under its fluorescent lights and 18 different people who were supposed to know what they were doing had run out of ideas. The floor around the Series 7 had taken on the atmosphere of a waiting room. Technicians stood in clusters, talking in low voices. The outside engineers from Cincinnati had retreated to one corner and were on their phones. Ron Stiles was doing what Ron Stiles did when he didn't know what else to do, which was walking in a slow circle, looking at things. Ava stood at the edge of the space and looked at the machine and thought about 43 days, which was now 41 days, and 140 million, which was beginning to feel like a number from a story about someone else's company. She was so deep in her own head that she almost didn't hear the voice. "Excuse me." It was quiet, not demanding, not tentative, just present. The kind of voice that didn't expect to be ignored, but also wasn't going to perform outrage if it was. Ava turned. He was standing about 8 feet behind her, just far enough back that he'd clearly been waiting for a pause in her thinking rather than interrupting it. He was maybe 6 feet tall, on the lean side of average build, with dark hair that needed a cut, and the particular tiredness around his eyes that doesn't come from a bad night's sleep. It comes from a long time of not quite sleeping enough. His uniform was the standard Hartwell Maintenance Navy, and his name was embroidered on the chest in white thread, Rowan. She didn't know his first name. She wasn't sure she'd ever seen his face, which was possible. Hartwell had 340 employees, and the maintenance team worked nights. "I work nights," he said, as if he'd read her expression. "Caleb Rowan. Maintenance, third shift." "I know what maintenance is," she said, not unkindly, but not warmly either. She was 41 hours into a crisis and running low on warmth. "What is it?" He looked at the machine, not at her. "I've been watching since last night, the engineering teams running their diagnostics." A pause. "I was wondering if I could take a look at it." From behind her, she heard a sound. It was Derek Paulson, the senior engineer from her internal team, making the specific kind of brief, involuntary laugh that very credentialed people make when they hear something that strikes them as categorically absurd. Derek had a master's degree in industrial systems engineering and had been at Hartwell for 11 years. "With respect," Derek said, and his tone carried exactly as much respect as you'd expect from a man who'd just been awake for 30 hours. "We've had 3 engineering teams and the manufacturer's own specialist on this machine. I'm not sure what maintenance is going to find that—" "Derek," Ava's voice was flat. Derek stopped. She looked back at the maintenance worker, at Caleb Rowan, and she studied his face for a moment. He wasn't performing anything. He wasn't trying to look confident or impressive. He was just standing there, watching the machine with an expression she couldn't quite name. Patient, maybe. Or the face of someone who already knew something and was waiting to be allowed to show it. Part of her. The part that had been up for 41 hours and was staring at a potential disaster almost said no. Almost said something polite but dismissive, and turned back to the very expensive problem in front of her. The instinct was there. The logic for it was there. He was a night shift maintenance worker. The manufacturer's own engineer couldn't find the problem, but there was something in the way he was looking at that machine. 5 minutes, she said. Derek made a sound. Derek, she said again, same flat tone. Derek said nothing. Caleb didn't rush. That was the first thing people noticed, or more accurately, the first thing they noticed afterward, when they were trying to reconstruct what had happened. He didn't stride up to the machine with the energy of someone trying to prove something. He walked up to it the way you'd approach something you wanted to understand, not something you wanted to conquer. He stood in front of it for about 30 seconds, not touching it, just looking. "What is he doing?" someone murmured, behind Ava. She didn't turn around to see who. Then Caleb placed his palm flat against the machine's lower housing panel. He held it there. His eyes closed slightly, and his head tilted about 5 degrees to the left. And he was absolutely still. "Is he—" Derek started. "Shh." This came, unexpectedly, from Marcus Webb, the senior floor operator who'd been the first one on scene Tuesday night. Marcus had been around machines long enough to recognize something in what he was watching, even if he couldn't have articulated what it was. Caleb moved his palm slowly along the housing, stopping at 2 different points, each time going still. Then he crouched down, putting his ear close to the lower section. His lips moved, very slightly, as if he were counting something. Then he stood up, went to the maintenance bag he'd set down near the machine's side, and took out a small flashlight. He turned to the right side of the machine, the side that faced the wall, the side that would require you to essentially squeeze into a narrow gap between the Series 7 and the steel shelving unit that had been placed next to it at some point and never moved. He looked at the gap. "Can we move that shelf unit?" he asked. Ron Stiles was the one who answered, quickly, because something in Caleb's manner had apparently convinced him this was worth responding to. "Yeah, Marcus." It took 4 minutes to clear the shelf unit away from the wall. Caleb stepped into the space it had occupied, crouched down, and shone his flashlight along the lower right quadrant of the machine's housing, a section that, in the 3 days of intensive diagnostic work, no one had opened, because the machine's access panel diagram showed it as a secondary junction housing that was factory sealed and rarely required service access. There was a panel there, Old. The access screws were painted over slightly, not deliberately, just the kind of thing that happens when a machine gets repainted during routine maintenance and nobody thinks to mask the secondary panels. Caleb took a flathead screwdriver from his bag and worked the screws out, one by one, unhurried. Ava found herself moving closer without deciding to. Caleb pulled the panel away, shone his light inside, and for a moment was completely silent. "There it is," he said. It was very quiet, the way he said it. Not triumphant, not "I told you so," just the simple statement of someone who'd been looking for something and had now found it. "What?" Ava was right behind him now. "What do you see?" He stepped back to let her look. She crouched, took the flashlight he offered, and pointed it into the housing. Inside, in a bank of small components she couldn't have named without a service manual, there was a relay, no bigger than a matchbox, that looked slightly different from everything around it. Not obviously dramatically different, but there was a subtle discoloration on its surface, a faint grayish tint where the metal should have been clean. "Thermal relay," Caleb said behind her. "Oxidized. Not enough to fail by the numbers. The diagnostic system reads it as functional because it still conducts. But under load, the oxidation creates enough resistance variability that the machine's logic controller hits an inconsistent signal. Doesn't register as a fault, just reads as," he paused, "ambiguous. So the system stops and waits." Ava stood up slowly. She looked at Caleb. He was already reaching into his bag. "You have the part?" she asked. "Standard thermal relay. We keep them in stock. I grabbed a couple before I came over." He said it without inflection, like someone mentioning they'd brought an umbrella because the sky looked uncertain. Derek Paulson was standing 5 feet away, and the expression on his face was one of those expressions that a person's face makes before their brain has finished telling it what to feel. The repair took 11 minutes, not because it was complicated, but because Caleb was careful. He cleaned the housing before installing the new relay. He checked the adjacent connections while he had access, found one that wasn't faulty but was showing early wear, and replaced it anyway because he was already there. He reseated the panel and replaced the screws in the correct order. Then he stepped back. "You can try the startup sequence now," he said. Ron Stiles looked at Ava. Ava looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at the machine. Marcus Webb walked to the control panel, ran through the startup protocol, and pressed the initiation sequence. The Series 7 industrial fabrication system came alive with a sound like a held breath being released. A deep building hum that rose through the floor, through the feet of everyone standing around it, up into their chests. And the status board blinked from dark to green across every indicator simultaneously. Nobody said anything for about 4 seconds. Then the floor erupted. Not into cheers exactly, more like the sudden collective exhale of 61 hours of tension leaving a room. People were laughing, not because anything was funny, but because that's what happens when a body has been holding itself tight for too long and is suddenly allowed to let go. Marcus Webb put both hands on the control panel and bowed his head for a moment, like a man in private prayer. Derek Paulson was very quiet. Klaus Bauer, the manufacturer's specialist who'd been standing near the conference room doorway, walked slowly to the opening in the housing, looked at the old relay sitting on Caleb's work cloth, and then looked at Caleb with an expression that was complicated and professional and contained something that, in another context, might have been respect. Ava Sterling stood in the middle of all of it and felt, more than heard, the machine's rhythm rebuild itself, the sequence cycling up, the indicators confirming, the production floor reawakening around her. Then she turned to find Caleb Rowan. He was packing his bag. "Hey," she said. He looked up. "What's your name again?" "Full name." "Caleb Rowan." "How long have you worked here, Caleb?" He considered. "About 4 years." "Third shift the whole time?" "Yes, ma'am." She wasn't used to people calling her ma'am. It wasn't sycophantic. He'd have said it to anyone. "How did you know to look there? At that specific panel?" "The service diagram doesn't even flag that as a primary access point." Caleb straightened up with his bag over his shoulder. He thought about the question for a moment, as if he were deciding how to answer it rather than whether to. "The machine wasn't telling the software anything was wrong," he said slowly, "but machines still talk, just differently." He glanced at the Series 7, which was now humming at full operational rhythm. The vibration pattern on the lower housing was slightly off. Not wrong enough that you'd catch it with instruments, but wrong enough. He looked back at her. I've been listening to this machine for 4 years. Ava studied him. His hands were calloused. There was grease under 2 of his fingernails that hadn't come out despite whatever washing had preceded this conversation. His boots were old but maintained, resoled at some point, kept clean at the toe caps. Everything about his presentation said working man, night shift, invisible. But his eyes, when he was talking about the machine, had been doing something different entirely. I'd like to talk with you more, she said. When you have time. Something crossed his face, not quite discomfort, not quite reluctance. More like a person who had gotten used to being left alone and was recalibrating to unexpected attention. Sure, he said carefully. Whatever you need. He shouldered his bag and walked back down the production floor toward the maintenance station, unhurried, the same as he'd walked up. Ava watched him go. Around her, the floor was coming back to full noise, machines running, voices, the return of normalcy. But her mind wasn't on any of it. It was running back through the past 3 days, through 3 teams of engineers and 1 manufacturer's specialist and 12-page reports and $16,000 in outside consulting fees, and then landing on the image of a maintenance worker placing his palm flat against a machine's housing and closing his eyes to listen. Who is this man? She didn't say it out loud, but she was already thinking about how to find out. Ron Stiles found her 20 minutes later, standing at the window of the conference room with a cup of coffee she'd made and not touched. Hell of a thing, he said. Yeah. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, through the glass, they could see the production floor running, the Series 7 back in sequence, the crew back at their stations, the particular organized motion of a factory that had remembered how to be a factory. You knew him? Ava asked. Caleb Rowan. Did you know anything about him? Ron shrugged, which was a complicated gesture. He's good at his job, quiet, always on time. I've had maybe, 6 conversations with the man in 4 years. He fixes what needs fixing and goes home. Does he have family? Little girl, 7, maybe 8. She's the one he talks about. Just a few words here and there. Single dad. I don't know the details. Ava turned that over. That's it? That's all anyone knows about him? He's the night shift, Ron said gently. We don't know much about most of the night shift. She thought about that. The invisible people keeping the building alive while everyone else went home. Get me his personnel file, she said. Please. Ron nodded and left. Ava turned back to the window and watched Caleb Rowan's figure move through the far end of the production floor. Methodical, unhurried, stopping once to check something on a secondary machine as he passed it. The way a person does when they are always, automatically, paying attention. The coffee was cold. She drank it anyway. 41 days left before the Meridian inspection. The machine was running, but something else had shifted in the room tonight, something less tangible and more permanent, and Ava Sterling, who had spent 3 years learning not to miss things, felt it clearly, even if she couldn't yet name what it was. She was going to find out who Caleb Rowan was. Something told her she was not prepared for what she was going to discover. The personnel file on Caleb Rowan was thin. That was the first thing Ava noticed when Ron Stiles set it on the conference room table in front of her the following morning. A standard manila folder, maybe a 1/4 inch thick, the kind of file that accumulates naturally over 4 years of employment and contains exactly what it's supposed to contain and nothing more. Application form, tax documents, 2 performance reviews, both marked satisfactory, with brief handwritten notes from the night shift supervisor at the time. A copy of his technician certification. Emergency contact. A woman named Patricia Rowan, listed as mother with an Ohio area code. No disciplinary records. No commendations. Nothing that would make you look twice. Ava read through it twice anyway, slowly, the way she read contracts, looking for what wasn't there as much as what was. Then she set it down and looked at Ron, who was standing near the door with his coffee and the patient expression of a man waiting to be told what came next. This is everything? She asked. That's what HR has on file. No prior employment history beyond what's on the application? Ron shook his head. He listed his previous employer as a consulting firm out of Columbus, Rowan Technical Solutions. Small outfit, apparently. HR called for reference when he applied, standard check, and got a basic confirmation. Employment dates, job title, no further comment. Reference said the firm had dissolved. Ava picked up the application form again. Under previous position, Caleb had written Systems Technician, Rowan Technical Solutions, Columbus OH, 2013-2019. Under reason for leaving, he'd written 3 words, company closed down. Did anyone look into it further? It was a night shift maintenance position, Ron said, not unkindly. We confirmed he was certified, confirmed he could do the work, ran a background check that came back clean. That's the standard process. She knew that. She knew the standard process. She'd reviewed it herself when she took over operational oversight. For a maintenance technician role on the 3rd shift, a reference call and a clean background check were what the process required. Nobody had done anything wrong. Nobody had been negligent. They just hired a man and put him in a uniform and sent him to work in the dark, and in 4 years nobody had thought to ask who he actually was. She closed the folder. I want to know more about Rowan Technical Solutions, she said. Whatever you can find. Ron nodded once and left. Ava sat alone in the conference room and listened to the sound of the production floor on the other side of the wall, the Series 7 running at full capacity, the rhythm of it steady and unbroken, doing in 1 hour what it hadn't done in 3 days. The sound should have been satisfying. Mostly it made her think about how close they'd come to a different outcome, and about an 11-minute repair performed with a flathead screwdriver and a replacement part from stock. She thought about what Caleb had said. Machines still talk, just differently. She thought about his hands, the calluses, the grease that wouldn't wash all the way out. She thought about a dissolved consulting firm and a thin personnel file and a little girl whose name she didn't know. Then she picked up her phone and called someone who was very good at finding things that other people hadn't thought to look for. Her name was Janet H. Sue, and she ran the small research team that Ava kept on contract for due diligence work during acquisitions and partnerships. Janet was methodical and discreet, and had a particular talent for finding the shape of things by looking at the empty space around them. I need you to look into someone, Ava said when Janet picked up. Personal background research. I'll send you what we have, which isn't much. His name is Caleb Rowan. Timeline? As soon as you can. Is this sensitive? Ava considered. I don't know yet, she said honestly. That's sort of the question. She hung up, looked at the folder one more time, and went to find Caleb Rowan. It was 7:20 in the morning. His shift had ended at 6. She went to the maintenance station first, empty, one of the day shift techs already at the workbench. Then to the parking lot, where she caught him just as he was unlocking a dark blue pickup truck that was older than the parking lot probably deserved. Mr. Rowan. He turned. He'd changed out of his uniform into a plain gray sweatshirt and jeans, and without the Hartwell embroidery on his chest, he looked like roughly half the men in the county. Mid-30s, tired eyes, nobody's idea of remarkable. Ms. Sterling. He waited. She stopped a few feet from him. The morning was cold and flat, the sky the particular white of early November in the Midwest, and she was standing in a parking lot at 7:20 a.m. in her good coat, having a conversation she hadn't entirely planned. Do you have a few minutes? My daughter's at my neighbor's from last night, he said. I need to pick her up by 8. He wasn't apologizing, just stating the fact. I'll be quick, she gestured toward the building. Or we can stand here, whatever you prefer. He leaned against the side of the truck, arms crossed loosely, which she took as here is fine. Okay. Last night, she said. I've been trying to understand it. 3 engineering teams, manufacturers specialist, and everyone is working from the machine's diagnostic systems. You walked up and did something different. Can you explain that to me? In plain terms? How you knew where to look? Caleb was quiet for a moment. He wasn't stalling. She was getting used to the rhythm of him, the way he actually thought before he spoke, rather than filling space with words. When a machine's diagnostic systems are telling you everything is fine, but the machine isn't running, it means the fault is somewhere the diagnostics aren't looking. The software monitors what it was designed to monitor. It can't monitor what's outside its parameters. So you looked outside the parameters. I looked at the machine. A pause. There's a difference between reading about a fault and feeling where it is. The Series 7's vibration signature has a specific pattern when it's healthy. I've listened to it long enough that I know when something's off. Last Tuesday night, when it shut down, I was working on a secondary pump unit about 60 feet away. I heard it stop. You heard it stop from 60 feet away? I felt it stop, he corrected quietly. The floor vibration changed. And then when I came over to look, before the engineering team got there, I noticed the vibration in the lower housing panel was different from what it should be even in a dead machine. Even at rest, there's a slight resonance from the building systems that passes through the structure. It wasn't distributing evenly. He paused again. That told me there was probably a thermal or electrical variance in a component that wasn't being read as faulty, which meant it was in a section the diagnostic system either didn't cover or was misreading. Ava looked at him. That's not standard maintenance knowledge. He didn't answer immediately. Where did you learn that? She asked. Something moved behind his eyes. Not evasion exactly, but the careful movement of a person deciding how much of a room to let you into. I've been around machines a long time, he said. It wasn't a lie, but it was a door held mostly closed. She let it go for now. Your daughter, she said, shifting. How old is she? Whatever he'd been bracing for, it wasn't that. His expression changed in a way that was subtle and unmistakable, the slight softening around the eyes that happens when people talk about something they love without reservation. 7. She'll be 8 in February. What's her name? Lily. Is she... You're raising her on your own? A beat. The softness didn't leave exactly, but it took on weight. Yeah, since she was 4. Ava didn't ask the next question. She didn't need to, and it wasn't her place yet. But she filed away the math. 4 years ago, Caleb Rowan had taken a night shift maintenance job at Hartwell. 4 years ago, something had changed in his life significant enough to make a man end up here instead of wherever he'd been before. Thank you for your time, she said. And thank you for last night. He nodded once, with the manner of someone who didn't know quite how to receive gratitude and defaulted to brevity. He got into the truck. She stood back. As he pulled out of the parking space, she caught a glimpse of the passenger seat through the window. A small purple backpack, a folded piece of paper that might have been a drawing, a children's book face down with a bright yellow cover. She stood in the cold parking lot and watched the truck until it turned out of the lot onto the main road, and she thought, there is so much more to this man than anyone here has ever bothered to look at. Then she went inside to her office and started working and waiting for Janet Chassou to call back. The call came 2 days later. Ava was in a budget meeting when her phone buzzed with Janet's name, and she did something she never did in budget meetings. She stood up, apologized to the room with a gesture that was not particularly apologetic, and walked out into the hallway to take it. Talk to me, she said. Janet's voice on the other end was the tone she used when she had found something that surprised her, which didn't happen often. Before I say anything, I want to confirm we're talking about the same person. Caleb Andrew Rowan, born 1992, currently employed as a maintenance technician at Hartwell Advanced Manufacturing, Columbus, Ohio region? Yes. A brief pause. Okay. So, he applied to Hartwell in 2020 under a simplified employment history that was technically accurate but significantly incomplete. How incomplete? The consulting firm he listed, Rowan Technical Solutions, was real. He did run it briefly in 2019, and it did dissolve. But before that, from 2011 to 2018, he was a lead systems engineer at a company called Veritech Industrial Systems. Do you know them? Ava's hand tightened slightly on the phone. She knew Veritech. Most people in advanced manufacturing knew Veritech. They were a mid to large firm that specialized in designing proprietary industrial automation systems, the kind of deep architecture engineering that produced the frameworks other companies built their equipment on. I know them. He was there for 7 years. He was not a junior engineer. His title in his final year was Principal Systems Architect. He led a team of 12. Janet paused. Ava, he holds 4 patents. 2 are currently licensed to manufacturers in the US and Germany. The licensing revenue, before he stopped managing it actively, was in the mid-6 figures annually. The hallway was quiet. From inside the budget meeting room, Ava could hear the low murmur of discussion continuing without her. Patents, she said. 2 in precision thermal management systems for industrial fabrication equipment, which, I'll note, is exactly what your Series 7 uses. 1 in dynamic load distribution for multi-axis fabrication platforms. 1 in early-stage failure detection protocols for closed-loop manufacturing systems. Ava closed her eyes briefly. He designed detection systems. He helped design the theoretical framework that modern diagnostic systems and advanced fabrication equipment are based on, which is probably why he knew where the diagnostic system wasn't looking. Janet's voice was careful, professional, but with the particular quality of someone who found the story they were telling genuinely remarkable. There's more. He had 2 papers published in industrial systems engineering journals. He was invited to present at the International Manufacturing Technology Conference in 2017. He turned it down. Why? I don't know. His life gets harder to trace around 2018, 2019. Oh, I found a marriage record. He married a woman named Claire Rowan, née Alderton, in 2014. There's a death record for Claire Rowan in 2019. She was 28. Silence. The daughter, Ava said after a moment. Lily Rowan, born 2016. She would have been about 3 when her mother died. Ava stood in the hallway and absorbed that for a moment. 3 years old. He'd said since she was 4, so about a year after losing his wife, or close enough. A year of what, exactly, before he landed in a maintenance uniform on the night shift of a mid-tier manufacturing company? What happened to the patents, she asked. The licensing? Still technically active. His attorney of record is still processing the renewals. But there's been no active management, no new filings. It's like he stopped. Another pause. One of the engineers at Veritech I managed to reach, I was discreet, I didn't mention Hartwell, described him as, and I'm quoting here, probably one of the best systems thinkers I've ever worked with. He could hear a machine problem before the instruments caught it. His words. Ava let out a slow breath. He could hear a machine problem before the instruments caught it. Thank you, Janet, she said. Please keep this between us for now. Of course. One more thing. A brief pause. The patents. The royalties that are still accumulating from the German license, he's been routing them, automatically, into a college savings account. For Lily. Ava didn't say anything. Just thought you should know, Janet said, and hung up. Ava stood in the hallway for a long moment before she went back into the meeting. When she sat down and looked at the budget projections on the screen, the numbers didn't mean anything to her for a solid 3 minutes. She was thinking about a man who had helped design the diagnostic systems that everyone else had trusted to tell them what was wrong with a machine, and who had then spent 4 years in a maintenance uniform on the night shift, listening to that machine in the dark, knowing things no instrument was going to confirm. She was thinking about a purple backpack on a truck seat, and a college fund accumulating for a little girl, and a man who had apparently looked at everything he'd built, the career, the patents, the professional identity, and quietly walked away from it. She needed to understand that. Not for strategy, not for the contract. She needed to understand it in the way you need to understand something that has changed the way you see a room. She was going to go find him again, but she was going to do it carefully. Because something told her that Caleb Rowan was a man who disappeared from rooms very easily and very deliberately, and the last thing she wanted to do was make him feel cornered. 3 days after Janet's call, Ava found her opening. It wasn't manufactured. She wasn't the kind of person who manufactured things and was bad at it when she tried. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and she was doing what she occasionally did when she needed to think without the pressure of an office, walking the floor. Not inspecting, not supervising, just moving through the space. Her father had taught her that. Walk the floor when you're stuck, he used to say. The answers are usually in the room, not in the reports. She found Caleb in the secondary equipment room off the main production floor, a space that housed the backup hydraulic systems and auxiliary power units, the kind of room that stayed clean and functional because someone was maintaining it and would remain invisible because no one thought about it until it stopped working. He was on his knees beside a hydraulic coupling assembly, doing something precise with a torque wrench, and he didn't hear her come in because the room had its own background hum. She stood near the doorway for a moment watching. He worked with the particular economy of someone who had done this kind of thing so many times that the motion had become minimal. No wasted movement, no hesitation, nothing performed. Just the work, done correctly. Hydraulic coupler, she said. He looked up, no particular surprise in his face. Seal is starting to show wear. Caught it this morning on my rounds. He turned back to the assembly. It would have held another few weeks, probably. Maybe. Or it might not have. Or it might not have, he agreed. She came further into the room and leaned against the secondary workbench, not crowding him, giving him space to keep working. Can I ask you something while you do that? Sure. How long have you been doing this, maintenance work? A beat of silence while he worked the torque wrench through another partial turn. Officially? About 4 years? She let that sit. Officially. And unofficially? He finished the coupling, lowered his tool, and sat back on his heels to look at it. Then he looked at her. The expression on his face was the same one she'd seen in the parking lot, the deliberate assessment of someone deciding how much of a window to open. You've done some research, he said. It wasn't an accusation. She didn't deny it. Yes. He nodded once, not angry. Maybe something closer to resigned, but not quite that either. What did you find? Enough to have a lot of questions, she said honestly. But I'd rather hear it from you than from a background report, if that's something you're willing to do. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. He picked up a clean rag from beside him and wiped the torque wrench slowly, the way people do when they need something to do with their hands while they think. I spent 8 years doing systems engineering, he said at last. Industrial automation design, I was good at it. He said it simply, without pride and without false modesty, just the plain fact. I worked with some smart people. We built some things that worked and some things that didn't. The patents, she said. He glanced at her. Yeah. The thermal management systems. A brief pause, and something in his jaw shifted. You did thorough research. I have good people. She paused. Caleb, you helped design the theoretical framework that the Series 7's diagnostic system is based on. Did you know that? Did you know that specific machine when you were working here? He looked at the coupling assembly. I knew the family of systems. I didn't know this specific unit until I started working on it here. Something around his mouth shifted. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. The kind that comes from an irony that's had time to become familiar. It was a strange thing to meet, like running into someone who speaks your language in a place you didn't expect. Ava watched him. What happened? She asked, and her voice was quiet enough that it wasn't a demand. Between 2018 and walking in here? The question landed in the room, and he let it sit there. He folded the rag carefully, set it aside. My wife died, he said. Claire. She had a brain aneurysm. April 2019. She was 28 years old. He said it without his voice breaking, which Ava suspected wasn't because it didn't hurt. It was because he'd said it enough times to have built a kind of container around it. Lily was 3. Almost 4. He paused. After that, I spent about 8 months trying to figure out how to keep doing the job I was doing while raising a 3-year-old alone. And the answer was, I couldn't. Not the way I was doing it. The hours, the travel, the constant demand for the kind of thinking that takes everything you have. He looked at his hands. I was making decent money. I had the patents, the licensing income. I could have gotten childcare, could have hired help. I had people offering to step in. A beat. But Lily had just lost her mother. She was 3 years old and she'd just lost her mother, and every time I tried to picture leaving her with someone else while I went back to being the person I was, I couldn't get past it. Ava was still. So I stopped, he said. Took some time. Set up the small consulting firm, did minimal contract work for a while, just enough to stay sharp. And then I realized even that was taking too much. Too much of my head, too much time away from her. He looked up. I applied here because night shift maintenance meant I was home in the morning when she woke up. I was there for school drop-off. I was there in the evening until she was asleep. And then I came to work, and nobody needed anything from me except to keep the machines running, which I could do and still have enough of my head left over to be her dad. He paused. That was what I needed. That was exactly what I needed. The room was quiet except for the background hum of the auxiliary systems. You could have done this at any maintenance company, Ava said carefully. Why Hartwell? The corner of his mouth moved again. I liked the machine. She stared at him. The Series 7. I'd read about Hartwell's acquisition of it. I wanted to work on it. He said it completely seriously. It's a good machine, complicated, interesting. A pause. I know how that sounds. It sounds like you, she said, and she meant it as an observation, not a judgment. He looked at her for a moment, and something about the way he did it suggested he wasn't entirely sure what to make of her. I'm not looking for anything to change, he said. I want to be clear about that. I'm not I didn't fix that machine because I wanted a promotion or because I was trying to show anyone anything. I fixed it because it was broken and I could fix it, and there was a lot riding on it. I know, she said. I like my job, he continued. I'm not being self-deprecating. I genuinely like this work. I like walking into a room in the dark and keeping everything running. I like knowing every sound this floor makes. He paused. Lily starts third grade next year. She's doing well. I'm not looking to be someone different than who I am right now. I understand that, Ava said. And she did. Or she was beginning to. I'm not trying to take anything from you, Caleb, but I want you to know. What you did 3 days ago was not a small thing. 3 teams of credentialed engineers couldn't find what you found in 5 minutes. I had the manufacturer's own specialist in this building, and he told me the problem was unfindable. And then you found it with a flashlight and a spare part from stock. He was quiet. I'm not doing anything with that information today, she said. I just wanted you to know that I know, and that it matters. He looked at her for another moment, then nodded. The brief, unceremonious nod of a man who had heard the thing and would think about it and didn't need more conversation about it right now. He picked up his tools and began to pack them back into the bag. Lily drew a picture of the factory, he said, after a moment, his back partly turned. Last week, for school. Her teacher asked them to draw somewhere that was important to them, and she drew the factory. Because this is where her dad goes at night to take care of the machines. He didn't say it with sentiment exactly, just reported it. She drew the machines with faces. Ava smiled before she could stop herself. Did they look happy? The Series 7 had a very serious expression, he said, which I thought was accurate. She laughed, a real one, small and surprised. And it felt strange in this utilitarian room full of hydraulic equipment and the smell of machine oil. He stood, tools packed, and looked at her one last time. I'm going to go finish my rounds, he said. Of course, she said. Thank you for talking to me. He nodded once more and left the room, and Ava stood alone in the hum of the auxiliary systems, turning over everything he'd said. She thought about a woman named Claire who had been 28 years old, about a little girl who drew machines with faces, about a man who had patents worth 6 figures in licensing income and was choosing deliberately, every single day, to spend his best hours on the night shift in a building where nobody knew his name. She had run companies. She had made decisions that moved millions of dollars and affected hundreds of lives. She had been called a visionary, which she was privately skeptical of, and a tough negotiator, which she accepted as accurate, and a natural leader, which she thought mostly meant she was comfortable making unpopular calls. She had never, she realized, made a decision like the one Caleb Rowan had made. She'd always assumed that the biggest thing you could give up was money or status or career. She was realizing now that those were not the biggest things at all. She walked out of the equipment room and back toward the production floor, where the Series 7 was running in its steady, unbroken rhythm, doing exactly what it was supposed to do, maintained by a man who understood it better than anyone who had ever been paid to understand it. There were 38 days until the Meridian inspection. Something had shifted in her thinking, quietly, the way the important shifts always happen, without announcement. And she was starting to understand that what Caleb Rowan represented for Hartwell was not just a man who could fix machines. It was a question she was going to have to sit with. What does a company lose when it never thinks to look at the person standing right in front of it? She didn't have the answer yet, but she was going to figure it out. And when she did, she suspected it was going to require her to be a different kind of leader than she'd been walking in the door that morning. The offer sat in Ava's desk drawer for 4 days before she did anything with it. She drafted it the morning after the conversation in the equipment room, typed it herself, not through HR, not through legal, just her in a blank document, and the particular clarity that comes from knowing exactly what you want to say before you figured out how to say it. Special technical advisor, a salary that reflected what the market would actually pay for someone with his background. Flexible hours structured around his daughter's school schedule. No mandatory meetings. No performance theater. Just his expertise, made available to the company in whatever form made sense. She'd printed it, read it twice, folded it, and put it in the drawer. Because she was not sure yet. Not about him. She was sure about him. What she wasn't sure about was whether she was about to do something that helped Caleb Rowan or something that helped Hartwell and would be dressed up as helping Caleb Rowan. She'd been in enough rooms where those two things got confused, and she didn't want to be the kind of person who confused them. She also wasn't sure how he'd take it. He'd been clear, in the equipment room. "I'm not looking for anything to change." He'd said it without aggression, without apology, with the calm of someone stating a preference they'd thought through and were not entertaining debate on. She'd heard people say similar things before, usually as a negotiating posture, the opening position before the real conversation started. But with Caleb, it had felt different. It had felt like information. So she waited. She kept walking the floor. She watched him work from a distance, the way you watch something you're trying to understand before you interfere with it. What she saw over those 4 days was instructive. She saw him stop at the secondary conveyor belt on the east side of the floor and spend 8 minutes doing something that, to a casual observer, looked like routine lubrication. But when she asked the day shift supervisor later what had been done to that belt, the supervisor said he didn't know of any recent service. She asked him to check the belt's mechanical condition. He came back 20 minutes later looking slightly unsettled, reporting that someone had caught and corrected an alignment issue in the belt's tracking system that, left unaddressed, would have caused a significant jam in the next 2 to 3 weeks. She saw him hold a brief, apparently casual conversation with one of the junior technicians, a 23-year-old named Dario, who'd been with Hartwell for 8 months and who, from what Ava had observed, struggled with confidence on the floor. She couldn't hear what they said. But afterward, Dario spent the rest of that shift with a slightly different quality of attention, the kind that comes from someone telling you, specifically and credibly, that you are capable of doing the thing you weren't sure you could do. She saw Caleb walk past the cooling system for the CNC cluster at 10:30 one night. She was there late, reviewing production schedules, and stop and stand very still for about 20 seconds, and then go get his tools and spend the next 40 minutes doing something to the intake manifold that she couldn't follow from her vantage point. The next morning, the day shift maintenance log had a note: cooling system intake, preventive cleaning, mineral deposit accumulation at primary filter, efficiency restored. Signed, Rowan C. Nobody had asked him to look at the cooling system. Nobody had flagged it. Nobody even knew there was an issue with it until after he'd fixed it. She thought about what Janet had said. He could hear a machine problem before the instruments caught it. She thought about his patents, about the detection protocols, about the framework he'd helped build that was now embedded in the diagnostic systems of the very machines he was maintaining on the night shift. On the 5th day, she took the offer out of the drawer, unfolded it, read it one more time, and made 2 changes. Then she went to find him. It was a Thursday. He was in the tool room at the start of his shift, organizing his kit with the methodical focus of a surgeon laying out instruments before an operation. The tool room was small and bright and smelled like metal and WD-40, and he looked up when she came in with the same unhurried equanimity he brought to everything. "Ms. Sterling, I told you to call me Ava." "Old habit," he said without embarrassment. He kept sorting through his tools. "Something wrong with the machine?" "Not that I know of, though if there were, you'd probably know before I did." She stepped inside and he made room without being asked, shifting slightly to give her space in the narrow room. She set the folded paper on the workbench beside him. "I want you to look at something. You don't have to respond tonight. You don't have to respond at all if the answer is no." He looked at the paper, didn't pick it up immediately. "What is it?" "An offer. A new position. I created it because it didn't exist before, and I created it for you specifically, which I want to be honest about so you understand this isn't a standard HR process." She paused. "It's called Special Technical Advisor. The details are in there. But the short version is, I want you to keep doing what you're already doing, and I want to pay you appropriately for what you're actually doing, and I want to make your knowledge available to the engineering team when problems come up." He didn't reach for the paper. He set down the tool he was holding carefully and looked at her. "I told you. You told me you weren't looking for anything to change." She met his eyes. "I'm not trying to change your life, Caleb. I'm not trying to take you away from your daughter or put you in an office or make you attend strategy meetings. I wrote the terms so that none of that happens. The hours are the same. The flexibility is the same. The only thing that changes is your title, your compensation, and the fact that when an engineer is stuck, you're authorized to walk up to a machine and do what you did last week without anyone having the standing to question whether you belong there." Something shifted in his face at that last part. Not much. but enough. She'd chosen those words carefully, because that was the thing that had stayed with her, more than the patents, more than the elegant diagnosis, more than any of the professional history Janet had uncovered. It was Derek Paulson's involuntary laugh when Caleb had stepped forward. The casual assumption by an entire room full of credentialed people that a man in a maintenance uniform had nothing to offer. She had been close to making the same assumption herself, and she was honest enough to be troubled by that. "You shouldn't need me to authorize you to do your job," she said. "But that's the world we live in, and I'd rather fix the part of it I can fix." Caleb picked up the paper. He unfolded it and read it, and she watched his face while he did. The stillness of it, the slight movement of his eyes tracking down the page. He read it the way he did everything, completely, without rushing. He reached the bottom and folded it again and held it in both hands for a moment. "The hours," he said. "It says flexible scheduling in alignment with current shift structure. That means night shift if you want night shift. I'm not moving you to days unless you ask. And the meetings. It says consulting basis as operationally relevant. That means if there's a technical problem that needs your input, I'll ask. It doesn't mean you're sitting in budget reviews or listening to people present quarterly slide decks." A pause. "The salary is what someone with your background should have been earning in 2020 when you applied for a maintenance job and my HR department didn't think to ask enough questions." She said it plainly. "I'm not doing you a favor. I'm correcting a mistake." He was quiet for long enough that she let him be quiet. Then he said, "I need to think about it." "Of course. And I'd want to talk to Lily." He glanced up. "She's 7, so her input has limits. But it's her life too." Ava found unexpectedly that something about that made her throat feel slightly tight. "That's a reasonable thing to do," she said. He nodded, folded the paper once more, set it in the front pocket of his tool bag. "I'll let you know by end of week." She left him to his shift. In the week that followed, while she waited, while the production floor ran and the countdown to the Meridian inspection moved past 30 days and then past 25, something else happened that she hadn't planned for. Derek Paulson asked to speak with her. He came to her office on a Wednesday morning, knocked on the open door rather than sending an email, which told her something about the nature of what he was about to say. Derek was 43, had been with Hartwell longer than she had, and had navigated her takeover with the careful neutrality of a person who'd decided to reserve judgment. She respected him for that, even when they disagreed, which they occasionally did. He sat down across from her and put his hands flat on his knees, which was the posture of a man who'd prepared something to say and was now doing the work of actually saying it. "I owe you an apology," he said. She waited. The night the Series 7 went down, when Rowan came forward, he looked at the surface of her desk briefly, then back up. "I laughed at him. I made a sound. I was dismissive. And I've been thinking about it since, and I wanted to say that it wasn't right." Ava looked at him. "Why are you telling me and not him?" Derek blinked. He paused. "I suppose I should say it to him too." "I think so," she said. Not harshly, just as a fact. He nodded, slower this time. "Do you know much about his background? Because I did some looking after what happened. And what I found made me feel pretty small, honestly." "I know his background." "Then you know that he probably understood that machine better than anyone else in the building, possibly better than most people in the industry." Derek's jaw moved. "And we were all standing around it for 3 days, running software diagnostics on a problem that was never going to show up in software, and he walked up and put his hand on it and found it in..." He stopped. "In 5 minutes. 11, actually," Ava said. "For the repair. The diagnosis was faster." "Right." Derek looked out the window. "I keep thinking, if you had dismissed him, if you'd let me dismiss him, and he'd walked away, we'd still be down." "Yes. Or we'd have started disassembling the machine, which would have taken weeks, and..." He stopped again. "I keep thinking about that." "So do I," Ava said. "The thing is," Derek said more slowly, "it's not like I'm a person who thinks maintenance workers are stupid. I don't think that. I don't believe that consciously. But there was something about the context, the uniform, the timing, the fact that he was suggesting something 3 engineering teams hadn't tried, and I just..." He rubbed the side of his face. "I pattern matched. I saw a night shift maintenance tech stepping into a room full of engineers, and I made a decision about what he was before he'd said or done anything. Ava let him sit in that for a moment. I know, she said finally. I almost did the same thing. He looked at her. Did you? I considered having security remove him, she said. There was a moment. She said it without flinching because she believed in being honest about the parts that weren't flattering. Something made me say 5 minutes instead. I'm not entirely sure what. What do you think it was? She thought about it. The way he was looking at the machine, she said. There was something in it that I recognized, even though I couldn't have said what it was right then. He was looking at it the way you look at something you already understand. She paused. I've had people look at me that way in meetings when they're waiting for the rest of the room to catch up. I recognized the expression. Derek was quiet for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, he said, My father was a machinist. 30 years. Never went to college. And he could do things with metal that none of the engineers he worked with could do. And he knew it, and they knew it, and nobody ever said a word about it. He looked at his hands. I have an advanced degree in industrial systems engineering, and I'm sitting here telling you that I made the exact same mistake with Caleb Rowan that I watched people make with my own father. A pause. That's a hard thing to sit with. Yeah, Ava said. It is. He stood up. I'm going to talk to him, tonight, if he's in. He's in, she said. He's always in. Derek left, and Ava sat in her office and thought about Derek's father and about Caleb's daughter and about the particular quiet way that certain kinds of knowledge get undervalued, not because anyone decided to undervalue them, but because the system of valuation was built by people who already knew what they were looking for and stopped looking for anything else. She thought about this for a long time, and then she started drafting something else. Not an offer this time. A policy. The beginning of one, at least. A rough framework for something that didn't have a clean name yet. Something about how the company solicited and recognized technical knowledge from across the entire workforce. Not just the people whose job titles included the word engineer. She'd need HR and the department heads in the room before it became anything real. She'd need Derek, actually. His buy-in would matter. But the shape of it was starting to come clear. She was still at her desk working on it at 7 p.m. when her phone buzzed. A text from a number that was in her contacts but that had never texted her before. It read, The answer is yes. C. Rowan. She read it twice. Then she set her phone down and looked at the draft policy on her screen, and for the first time in a week, something settled in her chest that had been sitting wrong. The yes from Caleb came with a condition, as she'd expected it would, and the condition was simple enough that she'd already anticipated it and built it into the offer. He would continue working his shift, doing his maintenance rounds, keeping the machines in the same shape he'd always kept them. The advisor role would exist alongside that, not instead of it. If someone needed him, they'd come to him on the floor. He would not be relocated to an office, would not be given a dedicated meeting slot in anyone's calendar, and would not be asked to produce reports. You're going to resist every attempt to formalize you, Ava said, when they met to discuss the terms. Probably, he said. That's going to frustrate some people. I know. He paused. Is that a problem? She thought about it genuinely. No, she said. I think that's actually part of what makes this worth doing. He gave her a look that said he wasn't entirely sure what she meant by that, which was fair because she was still working it out herself. What she meant, though she didn't have the full shape of it yet, was this. The value of Caleb Rowan to Hartwell was not just his knowledge. It was what his knowledge represented, what it said about where expertise actually lives versus where companies are trained to look for it. An advisor with a title and a meeting slot and a quarterly deliverable was a known quantity, a manageable shape. A man who walked the floor at midnight and prevented failures before they happened, and then went home to make his daughter breakfast, was something harder to quantify, and therefore something most organizations never bothered to value. She wanted to bother. His first month in the new role, insofar as it was a role, given that it looked exactly like what he'd been doing before, minus the ceiling on his involvement, was quiet in the way that good foundations are quiet. He didn't call press conferences. He didn't send emails to the engineering team announcing his availability. He kept his rounds, kept his kit, kept his hours. But word moves through a factory floor the way water moves through stone. Slowly, persistently, by the path of least resistance. and by the third week, the engineers knew. Derek had gone to Caleb, as promised, on the night after their conversation in her office. He told her about it afterward, briefly. He'd found Caleb at the secondary workbench, explained himself in plain terms without excessive performance of remorse, and offered his hand. Caleb had shaken it, said something that Derek reported as, "I've been dismissed by better people than you, and it's fine," which was either a compliment or the very driest possible form of acceptance, and then gone back to what he was doing. Derek had gone back to his desk and written the most substantive technical question he'd been sitting on for 3 weeks. A load distribution problem in the Series 7's multi-axis output that the engineering team had been circling without resolution, and sent it, in plain language, to Caleb's Hartwell email. Caleb's response came back at 2:47 a.m. in 7 sentences, with a diagram sketched on what appeared to be the back of a maintenance form and photographed on his phone. The diagram was clear. The explanation was clear. The solution, which involved an adjustment to the calibration sequence that was counterintuitive, but when Derek worked through it the next morning, completely sound, took 40 minutes to implement. Derek showed the email to the 2 other senior engineers on his team. By the end of the second week, the engineers had a running joke, which was how you knew something had moved from tension into acceptance. The joke was that checking with Rowan before escalating a technical problem was now faster and more reliable than the manufacturer's technical support line, which cost $400 an hour and had told them their machine's problem was unfindable. Caleb, when someone repeated the joke to him, said, "The support line is good. They just work from the documentation. The documentation can't tell you everything." 23 days before the Meridian inspection, something happened that nobody planned for. A different machine went down. Not the Series 7, a secondary fabrication unit, the Series 4, which was older and less critical, but which was running a component batch that the Meridian sequence depended on. It went down at 11:15 p.m. on a Tuesday, with a fault code that the day shift engineers had been tracking for 2 weeks and had tentatively attributed to a software compatibility issue in the updated firmware. The on-call engineer that night was a woman named Priya Nair, 31 years old, competent, 2 years at Hartwell, the kind of engineer who made up for gaps in experience with systematic thoroughness. She ran her diagnostic. She confirmed the fault code. She began the process of isolating the software issue. At 11:42 p.m., Caleb walked past on his rounds. He stopped. Priya looked up. She'd heard about the Series 7. She'd read Derek's emails about the load distribution question. She had not yet spoken directly to Caleb Rowan, but she was not the kind of person who let unfamiliarity become an obstacle. "It's giving me a firmware compatibility fault," she said, by way of greeting. "We updated the firmware 3 weeks ago, and there's been an intermittent issue since." Caleb looked at the machine. "Can I look at it?" "Please," she said, without hesitation. He did the same thing he'd done with the Series 7, which Priya would describe later to Derek as both eerie and completely logical once you understood what he was doing. He put his hand on the housing. He listened. He moved to the back panel, opened it, looked at the internal components with his flashlight. "Your firmware diagnosis is probably right," he said after a moment. "But it's not the root cause. There's a vibration damper on the primary axis mount that's failing. The vibration is causing intermittent contact issues with the firmware communication bus, which is why it presents as a firmware fault." Priya stared at him. "The damper is causing a connection issue that the system reads as firmware." "Yes." "So the firmware update didn't cause the fault." "It might have made it more visible, but it didn't cause it." Priya stood up and looked at the machine and worked through that for a moment. "If we'd kept troubleshooting the firmware, you'd have eventually gotten it. Probably." He paused. "Or you'd have kept chasing a software problem that's actually a hardware problem, and it would have kept presenting differently every time you thought you had it." She looked at him. "How do you know where to look?" He thought about the question. She'd learn, as Derek had, that he always thought about questions before answering them, which was unusual enough to be noticeable. "I've been listening to this machine for 4 years," he said. "Same as the 7. It has its own sound. When the sound is wrong, I go looking for why." He paused. "The vibration in the primary axis mount. I noticed it 3 weeks ago, actually. I didn't think it was critical yet. I should have flagged it." Priya blinked. "You noticed it 3 weeks ago?" "The onset of the vibration anomaly was subtle. I thought it had another month or 2 before it became a functional issue." He met her eyes. "I was wrong." I'll flag things sooner if they correlate with recent changes to the system. It was, Priya said afterward, the most disarming professional conversation she'd ever had. Not because he was charming, but because he was straightforwardly accountable in a way that most people weren't, and he said I was wrong without any scaffolding around it. The repair took 25 minutes. The machine was back up by 12:40 a.m. The component batch ran through the night without interruption. In the morning, Priya wrote a detailed incident report, which was standard, and attached it to an email to Ava with the subject line, "Something you should read before the Meridian inspection." The body of the email was 4 sentences. The last one read, "If we go into that inspection without him on the floor, I think we're missing something significant." Ava read the email at 6:45 in the morning, still in her coat, and thought about 22 days, which was how many remained. She thought about a room full of Meridian executives and aerospace engineers, and she thought about what it would look like to walk them through a production floor where every machine ran at optimal performance, not because the diagnostic software said they were fine, but because someone had actually been listening to them. She thought about Caleb's condition, quietly, without politics or unnecessary meetings. And she thought about whether what she was considering counted as unnecessary. She decided it didn't. She went to find him. He was at the end of his shift, which was becoming the time she found him most naturally. The turnover hour, when the night was done and the day was starting, and the floor was in transition. He was at the maintenance log station, writing up his night's notes in the same careful handwriting she'd come to recognize. She stood beside him and waited for him to finish a sentence. "The Meridian inspection is in 22 days, she said. "I know." He didn't look up from the log. As a technician, as the person who knows this floor better than anyone in the building. He looked up at that. "I'm not asking you to present or perform," she said, before he could object. "I'm asking you to be available. If their engineers have questions about the equipment, I want you to be the person they can talk to." She paused. "I think you might surprise them." He looked at her for a long moment with the particular expression of a man who has made peace with not being noticed and is now being asked to reconsider the terms of that peace. "It won't be a performance," he said, and it wasn't quite a question. "No," she said. "Not for me, anyway. I can't speak for the Meridian team." She paused. "I think they're going to be more interested in how this floor actually runs than in what it looks like when everyone's performing for an inspection." He looked at the maintenance log. He'd written 3 pages in his shift, detailed, thorough, the kind of notes that told you everything you'd need to know about the health of the equipment if you knew how to read them. Which, she reflected, was the problem. Most people didn't know how to read them because the person who wrote them had never been asked to explain them. "Okay," he said. She exhaled something she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Okay," she repeated. He went back to the log. She stood there for a moment longer, watching him write, thinking about the shape of what they were building here. Not just the inspection, not just the contract, but something less linear and more durable than both of those things. She was thinking about what it meant to actually see someone, not to discover them, not to rescue them. He didn't need rescuing, and she was increasingly clear on that. Just to look at them clearly, without the filter of what they were expected to be. It was a harder thing than it sounded. She'd been in business for 8 years, had led a company for 3, and she was 30 years old, and she was still learning how to do it. The 22 days moved the way time moves when something significant is approaching. Not fast, not slow, but with a quality of compression, as if each day contained slightly more than a day's worth of events, and the space between morning and night kept getting smaller. Ava felt it in the particular alertness that had settled into her since the Series 4 repair, the sense that the factory floor had shifted into a different register. Not louder, not more dramatic, but more awake somehow, as if the act of paying real attention to something had caused that thing to pay attention back. The engineering team's relationship with Caleb was the clearest indicator of the change. It hadn't happened in one dramatic moment. It had accumulated the way all real changes accumulate, in small, practical exchanges that each left a slightly different residue than the one before. Priya Nair had sent him a technical question via email 4 days after the Series 4 repair, a careful, detailed question about harmonic resonance patterns in the secondary fabrication units that she'd framed with almost excessive professionalism, as if she wasn't quite sure of the etiquette. Caleb responded at 3:15 a.m. with a 3-paragraph answer and a hand-drawn chart that was, Priya told Derek afterward, the clearest explanation of the concept she'd encountered since her graduate coursework. Derek, for his part, had started doing something that nobody explicitly sanctioned and nobody asked him to stop. He began including Caleb's informal input, attributed, with Caleb's knowledge, in the technical briefings he prepared for Ava's weekly operational review. Not prominently, just a line here and there. Per Rowan, the vibration signature on Unit 3 suggests the following. Or Rowan flagged this 3 days ago, which tracks with the current fault pattern. Small attributions. But in a meeting room, attribution is its own kind of record, and the record was building. Ron Stiles noticed it before he put words to it. He came to Ava one morning, 10 days before the inspection, and stood in her doorway in the way of a man who has been turning something over in his mind and has decided to say it out loud to see how it sounds. "The floor feels different," he said. Ava looked up from her laptop. "Different how?" "I don't know exactly." He frowned at the middle distance, working it out. "The technicians talk to each other more. The engineers are on the floor more. There's less of that thing where day shift and night shift are basically two separate companies that happen to use the same building." He paused. "I've been here 16 years and I don't think I've ever seen Derek Paulson eat lunch in the break room with the maintenance crew." "He did that?" "Tuesday. Sat with Caleb and Marcus Webb and two of the junior techs for 40 minutes. Ron's expression was that of a man who has witnessed something mildly improbable and is still processing its implications. They were talking about the cooling system layout. Not in a meeting, just talking. Ava thought about the policy draft that was now in its third revision, which she'd been working on with HR and which was beginning to take a form she thought might actually hold. The working title was still clunky, Cross-Functional Technical Input Framework, but the concept was becoming concrete, a structured process for soliciting, documenting, and crediting technical observations from any employee regardless of role or title, with a clear pathway for those observations to reach the engineering team and the operations leadership. She hadn't announced it yet. She was waiting until after the inspection, partly because she didn't want anything to look like it was staged for an audience, and partly because the inspection itself was going to make the case better than any announcement could. "How's the floor looking for the inspection?" she asked Ron. "Good," he said, with the careful honesty of a man who knows the difference between good and presentable. "Genuinely good, not just cleaned up good. The Series 7 has been running without a single fault code since the repair. The Series 4 has been cleaner than it's been in 8 months. Caleb caught 2 more minor issues last week, flagged them both to Priya before they became anything, both addressed." He paused. "He wrote something in the maintenance log last Thursday that I keep thinking about." "What?" Ron pulled out his phone, which surprised her slightly. Ron Stiles did not typically reference his phone in conversations. He'd apparently photographed the log entry. He read it aloud. "Unit 2, secondary feed roller. Slight tonal change in rotation, consistent with early-stage bearing fatigue. No current performance impact. Recommend inspection at next scheduled maintenance window or within 10 days if tonal change progresses. Not urgent. Worth knowing." He lowered his phone. "Not urgent. Worth knowing." He looked at her. "I've been running maintenance departments for 16 years, and I've never had a technician write something like that in a log. They write what's broken. They don't write what's going to be broken, with a timeline and an assessment of how serious it is." Ava thought about the patents, the detection protocols, the framework he'd helped design. "He's been doing that kind of assessment his whole career," she said. "We just weren't reading the logs closely enough to notice." Ron absorbed that. "Well," he said after a moment, "we're reading them now." He left, and Ava sat with that for a while. "We're reading them now." There was something quietly devastating about that sentence, if you let yourself sit with it. 4 years of logs. 4 years of a man writing detailed, technically precise assessments of the machines he maintained, in careful handwriting, in a binder that sat in the maintenance station and was reviewed, if it was reviewed at all, for the purpose of confirming that required service tasks had been completed. Not for the intelligence embedded in the observations, not for what they revealed about the health of the equipment. They'd been reading for compliance and missing the content entirely. She thought about how many other logs, in how many other departments, contained information the company was sitting on without knowing it. She put that thought in the same folder as the policy draft and went back to preparing for the inspection. 7 days out, Ava held a preparation meeting with her leadership team, Ron, Derek, the head of quality assurance, two members of the sales team who'd be managing the Meridian relationship throughout the visit. It was the kind of meeting she usually ran efficiently, 45 minutes with a clear agenda and clear outcomes. This one ran longer. The quality assurance head, a meticulous woman named Sandra Cho, who had the energy of someone who considered most things insufficiently rigorous until proven otherwise, had prepared a comprehensive inspection readiness review that was thorough and accurate and, Ava noted, contained no mention of Caleb Rowan. "Who's on the floor during the technical walkthrough?" Ava asked, midway through Sandra's presentation. Sandra looked at her notes. "Myself, Derek, and two members of his team, Ron, Marcus Webb for the operator perspective, and the usual day shift crew." She paused. "I have scripted talking points for each station, and we've prepared a technical brief that covers all the equipment specifications the Meridian team is likely to request." "I want Caleb Rowan on the floor during the walkthrough," Ava said. Sandra looked up. The pause that followed was half a second, which was enough to be informative. "He's maintenance," she said, and there was nothing dismissive in her tone. It was genuinely practical, the response of a person managing a complex logistics exercise. "I wasn't sure it was relevant for the executive walkthrough." "He's our special technical advisor," Ava said. "And if the Meridian team wants to understand how this equipment actually performs, he's the most qualified person in this building to explain it." Derek spoke before Sandra could respond. "She's right," he said simply. He'd developed the habit, in the past 2 weeks, of saying things simply that he might previously have hedged or elaborated. It made meetings faster. If they ask anything that goes beyond the specification documentation, and they will, because they're aerospace engineers, and that's what aerospace engineers do, Caleb is the person who can answer it. "I'm good at my job, but I work from the documentation. He works from the machine." Sandra considered this. She was not a person who changed her position easily, which was part of what made her good at quality assurance, but she was also not a person who confused stubbornness with principle. "Fine," she said. "I'll adjust the floor plan." She made a note. "I'll need to brief him on the sequence." "He knows the sequence," Ava said. "He's been on this floor every night for 4 years." Sandra made another note. "Does he know how to talk to executives?" The question was asked in good faith, without condescension, which made it more interesting to answer. Ava thought about every conversation she'd had with Caleb Rowan. The equipment room, the parking lot, the tool room, the maintenance log station at the end of his shift. "He talks the way he thinks," she said, "which is clearly and without wasted words. I think that's probably what aerospace executives want, actually." Sandra appeared to find this plausible. She moved on. After the meeting, Derek fell into step beside Ava in the hallway. "Are you nervous about the inspection?" he asked. "Yes," she said without hesitation. He nodded. "Me too." A pause. "Less than I was 3 weeks ago, though." "Why?" He thought about it. "Because 3 weeks ago, I was nervous about the machines," he said. "Now I'm confident about the machines. I'm nervous about the people." He glanced at her. "Which is harder to prepare for, but at least it's the right thing to be nervous about." She thought about that for the rest of the day. The night before the inspection, Ava stayed at the factory until nearly midnight. Not because there was anything left to do, everything that could be prepared had been prepared, but because she needed to be in the space. She walked the floor the way her father had taught her, slowly, without an agenda, letting the room tell her what it was. The day shift had gone home. The night crew was running. The machines were their own kind of music. The Series 7 in its steady, complex rhythm. The Series 4 with its cleaner sound since the damper repair. The CNC cluster with the cooling system that had been quietly, preventively restored 3 weeks ago. She knew these sounds now, or was learning to. Not the way Caleb knew them. That was 4 years of attention she hadn't paid, but more than she'd known them a month ago. She found him at the Series 7, which she might have predicted. He wasn't doing anything to it, just standing near it with his arms loose at his sides, his head slightly tilted, in the listening posture she'd come to recognize. He didn't hear her approach over the machine's noise, or if he did, he gave no sign. She stood beside him for a moment, looking at the machine. "How does it sound?" she asked. He glanced over. "Good," he said, "strong." He looked back at the machine. Sometimes after a repair like this one, sure, where the fault was in a thermal component, you get secondary calibration drift in the adjacent systems over the following weeks as the heat distribution normalizes. But it's been stable. He paused. It sounds right. I don't know what right sounds like yet, she admitted. I'm working on it. He glanced at her again, with an expression she hadn't quite seen before. Not warm, exactly. Not cold. Somewhere in the register of a person who has had an unexpected thought about someone and isn't sure what to do with it. You've been on the floor a lot at night, he said. Is that a problem? No. He was quiet for a moment. You could hear a lot if you listen long enough. The floor talks. He paused. It's different at night. The building's at rest. Less interference. The machine sounds are cleaner. That's why you like nights. Part of it. He didn't elaborate on the other parts, but she knew what they were. A little girl asleep at home, a neighbor checking in, a morning that belonged to his daughter rather than to production schedules and quarterly reviews. You're ready for tomorrow, he said. It wasn't a question. I think so. She paused. Are you? He considered this with the seriousness he brought to most things. I know this floor, he said. I know these machines. If they ask me something I don't know, I'll say I don't know. A beat. That tends to bother people in formal settings. It shouldn't. I know. He looked at the Series 7. But it does. She stood beside him and listened to the machine, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had found, over the course of a month of unexpected conversations in quiet corners of a factory building, that they didn't need to fill space with words, which was rarer than it should have been. My father used to walk this floor, she said, after a while. He looked at her, waiting. He built this company from a small parts supplier. He knew everyone by name. I mean, genuinely, not in the way executives say they know everyone. I knew Marcus Webb's wife's name and that she was going through treatment for something. He knew which technicians were working second jobs and why. He knew who wanted to move up and who just wanted to do their work and go home. She paused. He walked the floor every morning. He said the floor told you things the reports didn't. He was right, Caleb said. He got sick 3 years ago and stepped back, and I took over. And one of the things I thought I was going to do differently from him was run things more analytically, fewer gut decisions, better data, more rigorous process. She paused. I still think that was mostly right, but I lost something in the translation. Caleb was quiet. I had 3 engineering teams and a manufacturer's specialist and 12 pages of diagnostic reports, she said, and a broken machine. And a maintenance technician eating lunch in the break room who'd been listening to the machine for 4 years, he said, without any edge to it. And that, she said, which I almost missed. He nodded slowly. Most people do, he said. It's not a character flaw. It's just the way organizations work. You look where the information is supposed to be because that's the system. The system works most of the time. And when it doesn't? He was quiet for a moment, looking at the Series 7. When it doesn't, usually something breaks, he said, or someone notices something that isn't where the system is looking. He glanced at her. And whether that matters usually depends on whether the person in charge is the kind of person who listens. She absorbed that. What kind of person am I? It was a direct question, more direct than she'd intended, and she saw the slight adjustment in his posture that meant he was taking it seriously. He thought about it for what felt like a full 30 seconds. You gave me 5 minutes, he said, finally. I almost didn't. But you did. He looked at the machine again. That's the part that counts. She thought about that for a long time after she left the floor. She drove home at midnight through streets that were mostly empty, and the city looked different than it usually did. Quieter, more itself, stripped of the daytime performance. She thought about her father walking the floor every morning and knowing Marcus Webb's wife's name. She thought about 4 years of maintenance logs that nobody had read carefully enough. She thought about a college fund accumulating in the background of a man's deliberate invisibility and a little girl's drawing of a factory with machines that had faces. She thought about tomorrow. The Meridian team arrived at 9 a.m. in a group of 7, 2 executives, including a division VP named Gerald Pratt, who had the manner of a man who had been evaluating manufacturing operations for 30 years and was professionally immune to being impressed, and 5 engineers whose combined technical expertise covered aerospace fabrication, quality assurance, and supply chain systems. They were polite, organized, and carried the particular energy of people who intended to look at everything and take nothing at face value. The first 2 hours were standard. conference room presentation, quality metrics review, safety compliance walkthrough. Gerald Pratt asked precise questions and received precise answers, and the room maintained the careful formality of a significant business occasion. Ava was good at this part. She'd been in enough high-stakes rooms to know how to hold the air steady, how to be direct without being aggressive, how to listen to a concern and respond to what was actually being asked rather than what was being said. But she felt the real inspection beginning when they walked onto the production floor. It was midday, full operation, which was deliberate. She hadn't staged a perfect, quiet floor for the walkthrough. She'd specifically kept the full-day shift running because the only honest way to show Meridian what Hartwell could do was to show them Hartwell actually doing it. The Series 7 in full production sequence, the Series 4 running the component batch, the CNC cluster working through a titanium specification that was close to what the Meridian contract would require. Gerald Pratt stood at the edge of the floor and looked at it the way Caleb looked at machines, with a quality of attention that was doing real work. "The Series 7, he said. "This is the unit that had the extended downtime last month?" 61 hours, Ava said, without softening it. Thermal relay failure in a secondary housing that the diagnostic systems weren't monitoring. It's been running without fault since the repair, which I can document in detail. Pratt looked at the machine. "What caused the diagnostic gap?" This was the question she'd been waiting for. Not dreading, waiting. The fault was in a component that falls outside the standard diagnostic monitoring parameters. The system reads what it's designed to read. This was in a section that wasn't part of the standard monitoring architecture. She paused. "We identified it through physical inspection by someone who knows the machine's behavior patterns well enough to locate a fault the software couldn't see." Pratt looked at her. "Your engineering team?" "Our special technical advisor," she said, "who I'd like you to meet." She'd positioned Caleb at the Series 7 station, which felt right, his machine, his ground. He was in his Hartwell uniform, which she'd left deliberately unchanged. No special outfit for the inspection. He was what he was. When she brought the Meridian group over, she introduced him by name and title, Caleb Rowan, Special Technical Advisor, and then stepped back slightly, because this was not a moment that needed managing. Pratt extended his hand. "Technical Advisor. What's your background?" "Systems engineering primarily," Caleb said. He shook the hand. "Industrial automation design. I've worked with Series 7 family equipment for a while." One of the aerospace engineers, a younger man named Theo, whose energy suggested he'd absorbed a significant amount of coffee, had drifted toward the machine's control panel with the involuntary magnetism of someone who finds a piece of equipment genuinely interesting. "This is running the titanium sequence?" he asked, looking at the panel. "Modified spec for the component batch," Caleb said. "Adjusted for the material lot variance on the current stock. There's a slight density differential in the titanium we received this quarter, and the standard sequence parameters needed a compensation adjustment in the thermal cycle timing." Theo looked up. "You modified the sequence parameters for material lot variance?" "The manual allows for it. We documented the modification." Caleb paused. "Do you want to see the documentation?" "Yes," said Theo, immediately, and then looked at Gerald Pratt as if seeking permission for his own enthusiasm. Pratt was looking at Caleb. "The fault 3 weeks ago. You identified it through physical inspection. Can you walk me through how?" "The machine's diagnostic systems conduct electrical and software monitoring of designated components," Caleb said. "The thermal relay that failed was in a section of secondary junction housing that isn't part of the primary monitoring circuit. The system registered no fault because, from an electrical standpoint, the relay still conducted. It just conducted inconsistently under operational load." He paused. "The way I found it was, the machine's vibration signature when it was at rest was slightly different from its baseline. The fault was creating a minor thermal mass variance in the lower housing that changed the resonance pattern." He said this plainly, without performance, the way you'd explain something to someone you assumed was capable of following. "I've been maintaining this machine for 4 years, so I have a baseline to compare against." Pratt was quiet for a moment. Around him, the Meridian engineers were in various postures of attention, and the quality of their attention had shifted. It had become the specific focus of people who have heard something technically interesting from an unexpected direction. 4 years maintaining this unit," Pratt said. "Yes." "And before that?" Caleb met his eyes. Systems engineering, he said again. I designed some of the detection protocol frameworks that current generation industrial diagnostic systems are built on. He said it without pride and without false modesty, which is why I know what they monitor and what they don't. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when a room recalibrates. Theo said, quite quietly, "You designed the detection frameworks." "Some of them," Caleb said. "It was a team." Gerald Pratt had the expression of a man who had been evaluating manufacturing operations for 30 years and had occasionally been surprised. He looked from Caleb to the machine and back, and something in his posture, the slight forward shift, the uncrossing of arms, said that his professional assessment of the situation had just revised itself. "Tell me about the material lot variance adjustment," he said. And then, with a slight glance at the younger engineer, "Theo." "On it," Theo said, and was already at the panel with his tablet. What followed was not what Ava had planned, which was to say it was better. The scripted walkthrough that Sandra had prepared, thorough, professional, formatted for the kind of inspection that followed expected tracks, quietly dissolved and became something else. A conversation between engineers. Pratt and his team and Caleb moving through the production floor, talking about the equipment with the directness of people who spoke the same language and had dropped the formality because it was getting in the way. Ava walked with them and listened and let it happen. She heard Caleb explain the load distribution adjustment he'd suggested to Derek in a 2:47 a.m. email, using different language than he'd used in the email, simpler, more visual, and watched Pratt's senior quality engineer stop walking and write something in her notebook. She heard Theo ask about the cooling system adjustment and heard Caleb explain it in the same plain terms he'd used with Priya, and heard Theo say, under his breath, "That's a good catch," in the tone of a person who makes catches like that and recognizes the same quality in someone else's work. She heard Pratt, standing at the Series 7 station at the end of the walkthrough, ask, "What's your current failure rate on this unit?" "One unscheduled downtime event in the past 14 months, Ava answered. "The event last month. Before that, the unit ran without unscheduled interruption for 11 months. Pratt looked at the machine. "That's a good record for a Series 7. They're complex equipment." "We maintain them carefully," Ava said. She paused, and then said the thing she'd been working toward. "We've been investing in knowing our equipment deeply, not just monitoring it. That's the difference." Pratt looked at Caleb. "Is that a policy?" he asked. "Or a person?" The question was directed at Ava, but his eyes were on Caleb, which was honest of him. Ava looked at Caleb too, and found he was looking back at her with the same expression he'd had the night before at the Series 7, the unexpected thought he wasn't sure what to do with. "It started as a person," she said. "We're building it into policy." She paused. "Because you can't rely on finding the right person by accident. You have to build the systems that make sure you're not overlooking people in the first place." Pratt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's an honest answer." "I try," she said. He looked at the floor for another moment, then back at her. "Let's go back to the conference room," he said. "I'd like to talk about the contract terms." They went back to the conference room. Sandra and the sales team, who had been running the secondary part of the walkthrough with two of the Meridian executives, were already there. The room had the charged atmosphere of a conversation about to become significant. Ava took her seat at the head of the table, and Pratt took the one across from her, and the 17 people in the room arranged themselves in the unconscious geometry of two sides of a negotiation. But the negotiation, when it came, was shorter than expected, because Pratt had one more question first. "The Series 7 downtime event," he said. "If the maintenance technician, the advisor, if he hadn't been here, if you'd had a standard maintenance crew, what's the realistic outcome?" Ava didn't look away. "Weeks of downtime," she said. "Potentially disassembly of the unit to locate the fault. We'd have been talking to you today in a very different position." Pratt nodded slowly. "And he's been here 4 years." "Yes." "And you elevated his role?" Pratt glanced at his notes. "Approximately 3 weeks ago." "Yes." "Based on this incident." "Based on this incident clarifying something that should have been clear earlier," Ava said. "The capability was always here. We weren't looking at it correctly." Gerald Pratt looked at the table surface for a moment, and something about the movement of his jaw said he was turning something over. Not dissatisfied, not skeptical, something closer to thoughtful. "I've done a lot of these evaluations," he said. I've walked a lot of production floors with a lot of CEOs who wanted to tell me their operations were excellent. He paused. Usually they are what they are. Good, competent, reliable. That's fine. That's what we need. Another pause. What you described, building a system that stops you from overlooking people. That's a different kind of answer than I usually get. He opened the contract folder in front of him. Let's talk terms, he said. The conversation that followed took 2 hours and 20 minutes, which was not short, because 140 million over 5 years is not a thing that happens quickly and shouldn't. There were points of friction. The production capacity timeline, the quality certification requirements, the penalty clauses for delivery failure that Meridian's legal team had written with the intention of protecting themselves from exactly the kind of downtime event that Hartwell had just had. Ava pushed back on 2 of them, accepted a modified version of a third, and held firm on the 4th with the specific, grounded confidence of someone who knows what their operation can actually do. At 4:47 p.m., Gerald Pratt signed the first page of the framework agreement. Ava signed below him. The room did not erupt the way the production floor had erupted when the Series 7 came back to life. It was quieter than that. A round of handshakes, some genuine smiles from the sales team, a moment of something that felt like collective exhale in a more formal register. Sandra Cho permitted herself a small, satisfied nod. Derek, who'd been present for the technical portion and had taken a seat near the back of the room for the contract discussion, was looking at his hands on the table with an expression Ava couldn't quite read, though she thought it might be the expression of a man arriving at something he'd been working his way toward. After the Meridian team left, after the handshakes and the walk to the lobby and the necessary courtesies of a significant occasion ending, Ava went back to the production floor. She found Caleb where she'd expected to find him, not celebrating, not waiting for acknowledgement, back on his rounds, moving through the floor with the same economy of motion he brought to every shift. She watched him stop at the Unit 2 secondary feed roller, the one he'd flagged in the maintenance log, the not urgent, worth-knowing note that Ron had photographed, and spend 4 minutes checking the bearing with the focused, diagnostic attention of someone confirming a theory. He looked up when she got close. "How did it go?" he asked. "We got the contract," she said. He nodded once, clean and simple. "Good. $140 million over 5 years, she said. The largest contract in Hartwell's history. He looked at the roller bearing, turned it slightly with his hand, listening for something in the resistance. "Good," he said again, and she could tell he meant it, but she could also tell it was not the thing he was most focused on right now, which was somehow exactly right. "Gerald Pratt asked me about you," she said. "He wanted to know if what you represent here is a policy or a person." Caleb looked up from the bearing. "What did you say?" "I said it started as a person and we're building it into policy." She paused. "I meant it." He considered this. "That's the right answer," he said after a moment. "Because a person isn't scalable, and one person noticing things is just luck. If you don't build the system, that means you don't miss the next one." She looked at him. "Is that what you are? Luck?" He set down the tool he was holding. The production floor ran around them, steady and full, the Series 7 and the Series 4 and the CNC cluster all in their rhythms. "I'm someone who was here," he said, "and who you listened to." He paused. Both things had to be true. I've been in places where one of them was true and not the other. She thought about that. "The bearing?" she said, nodding toward the roller. "Needs replacement," he said. "Within the week, I'd say. I'll put it in the log tonight and schedule it with Ron." He picked up his tool bag. "Nothing urgent. Worth knowing." He moved on to the next station, and she stood in the middle of the production floor and watched him go, and thought about everything that had happened in the past 30 days. The machine that stopped, the man who was almost dismissed, the 11-minute repair that nobody should have been able to make, and the slow, imperfect, ongoing work of building something that didn't depend on luck or accident or a CEO who happened to say 5 minutes instead of get security. The floor kept running. She stayed until she was sure it didn't need her there. Then she went home, and for the first time in a month, she slept without the specific tension of a person waiting for something to go wrong. The contract signing didn't make the news. Hartwell wasn't the kind of company that issued press releases about its own good fortune, partly because Ava had always thought that was tempting something, and partly because the people most responsible for the outcome were not people who wanted to be in a press release. The morning after the Meridian team left, the factory ran its normal shift. The machines ran. The maintenance log got written. Caleb Rowan picked up his daughter from his neighbor Mrs. Petrakis at 6:45 a.m., drove home through the early November gray, and made Lily scrambled eggs and toast because it was a Thursday, and Thursday was scrambled eggs and toast, which was a rule Lily had established sometime in second grade, and which Caleb had no particular reason to dispute. He didn't tell her about the contract. He wasn't sure how to explain $140 million to a 7-year-old in a way that meant anything, and he wasn't sure it should mean anything to her yet. What he told her, when she asked how work was that things had gone well. "Did your machines behave?" she asked. This was how she framed it. Machines as entities capable of good or bad behavior, which Caleb had never corrected because he wasn't entirely sure she was wrong. "They behaved," he said. "Even the serious one?" "Especially the serious one." Lily appeared satisfied with this and went back to her toast. Caleb sat across the table from her and drank his coffee and watched her eat with the specific, unhurried attention he gave to mornings, which were the hours that belonged entirely to the two of them. I was tired in the way of a man who had not fully slept, but it was a different kind of tired than the month before. Lighter. Not the weight of something unresolved, but the ordinary tiredness of work done and a night passed. He thought about Gerald Pratt's face when he'd understood that the person who'd found the fault was the same person who'd helped design the systems that failed to find it. He thought about Theo, the young aerospace engineer, writing something down in his tablet with the focused energy of someone who'd encountered something genuinely worth writing down. He thought about Ava Sterling standing beside him at the Series 7 the night before the inspection, asking what the machine sounded like, and meaning the question. He hadn't expected any of that. He'd expected the job he'd taken, the job he'd chosen specifically because it didn't ask anything from him that he couldn't give while keeping the rest of himself for the person sitting across the table from him now, carefully constructing a tower from the crusts of her toast. He hadn't expected to find, in the middle of the careful life he'd built around loss and love and the quiet work of keeping things running, that something he'd set down could be picked up again. Not in the same shape, not with the same urgency or ambition, but picked up nonetheless and held differently, lightly enough that it didn't cost him anything he wasn't willing to spend. "Dad?" Lily said. "Yeah." "Is the factory going to be okay now?" He looked at her. She'd asked with the directness of a child who had absorbed, without being told explicitly, that something had been uncertain and was now perhaps less uncertain. 7-year-olds notice more than they're given credit for. "Yeah," he said. "I think so." She nodded, satisfied, and her tower of toast crusts achieved an ambitious 5th tier before collapsing, which she regarded with philosophical equanimity, and then began eating the ruins. Caleb drank his coffee and thought, this is the part that counts. 3 weeks after the inspection, Ava called an all-hands meeting. Hartwell had held these before, quarterly, for updates on production targets and safety metrics, and the kind of organizational information that employees are entitled to receive and usually receive in the most efficient format possible, which is to say, efficiently and without particular feeling. They were held in the main break room, which seated about half the company at once, and the rest watched a live stream from their workstations or phones. This one was different, and people felt the difference from the moment the agenda went out. No production targets, no safety metrics, just quarterly address, CEO. Ava had been preparing it for 2 weeks. She'd written it 3 different ways, thrown out 2 of them, and worked on the 3rd until it stopped sounding like a speech and started sounding like the truth, which took longer than she expected. On the morning of the meeting, she got there early and stood in the break room while it was still empty and looked at the chairs arranged in rows and thought about what she was about to do and whether it was the right thing or a performance of the right thing, which was a distinction that mattered to her and that she wasn't always sure she got right. She thought she was getting it right this time. She wasn't certain, but she was going to say it anyway. People filed in at 10 a.m. The day shift came first. Operators, engineers, quality staff, administrative team. The maintenance crew filtered in, most of them on the tail end of the night shift, some of them still in their uniforms. Marcus Webb took a seat near the front because Marcus Webb always sat near the front and had done so at every all-hands meeting for 22 years, which was a form of institutional loyalty that Ava had always found quietly moving. She'd asked Caleb to be there. He'd agreed without enthusiasm, and she'd accepted that because enthusiasm for all-hands meetings was not something she could reasonably require of anyone. And he was there, standing near the back with his arms folded, and the particular stillness he brought to rooms where he was not sure what to expect from them. She stood at the front of the room and waited until it settled. "I want to talk about something that happened 6 weeks ago," she said. "And I want to talk about it without managing it, which means some of what I'm going to say is going to be uncomfortable for me to say in front of all of you. That's probably how you'll know I mean it." The room was quiet. 6 weeks ago, our primary fabrication unit went down, the Series 7. It had been running a batch of titanium components for the Meridian contract, the $140 million contract that I'd spent months telling you was going to be the most important thing this company did in the next 5 years. She paused. The machine was dead for 61 hours. We had 3 engineering teams on it. We had the manufacturer's specialist flown in from Toronto. 12 pages of diagnostic reports that told us, essentially, that nothing was wrong with a machine that was completely stopped. She let that sit. And then a man on the night shift maintenance crew, a man who had been maintaining this machine for 4 years, who had been in this building every night while most of us went home, who had been writing maintenance logs that contained more genuine technical intelligence than most of our official diagnostic reports, walked up and said, "Can I take a look?" She looked at the room, looked at specific faces. Derek, who was looking at the table in front of him. Priya, who was watching Ava directly. Marcus, whose expression was the expression of a person hearing something confirmed that he'd already known. Ron, who was nodding slowly. And Caleb, at the back of the room, who was not looking at anything in particular, his jaw tight in the way of a person who is enduring something rather than enjoying it. "One of my senior engineers laughed," she said, "a single dismissive sound, and She stopped. "I considered having security remove him, not because I thought he'd done anything wrong, because he wasn't wearing the right title, because nothing about his job description suggested he should be the one standing there offering to look at a machine that 3 certified engineering teams couldn't fix." She paused. "That's what I want to talk about today. Not the contract, not the numbers. That moment." The room was very still. "I said 5 minutes," she said. "I don't know exactly what made me say it instead of something else. Maybe something in the way he was looking at the machine. Maybe I'd like to think it was some quality of judgment on my part. But honestly, I'm not sure it wasn't just chance. And chance is not a leadership strategy." She looked at her notes, not because she needed them, but because she needed the pause. The man I almost had removed from the room found the fault in under 5 minutes, fixed it in 11. He found it because he knew things about that machine that none of our diagnostic systems knew, because he had been listening to it, specifically and carefully, for 4 years. And because the fault was in a section of the machine that the diagnostic software, the software that we trusted completely, that every engineering team ran faithfully, wasn't designed to monitor. She paused. He knew that. He knew it because he helped design the protocols that the diagnostic systems are built on. Another pause. Before he worked the night shift here, before he was the person nobody looked at. She heard the shift in the room, the specific quality of an audience that has just understood something and is recalibrating around it. "His name is Caleb Rowan," she said, "and he is our special technical advisor, and he has been in this building every night for 4 years, doing work that was worth more than we were paying him and bringing knowledge that we were not organized to receive. That is not his failure. That is mine, and it is this company's. And I want to say it plainly because the only way to fix a mistake is to be honest about what the mistake actually was." She looked to the back of the room. Caleb was looking at the floor. His jaw was still tight. He was not someone who wanted to be standing in a room being talked about, which she had known and had decided was not sufficient reason to let the thing go unsaid. "The mistake wasn't cruelty," she said to the room, not to him. "It wasn't malice. It was the ordinary, invisible kind of mistake that organizations make every day. The assumption that expertise lives where the title says it lives. That the person with the advanced degree knows more than the person with the maintenance certification. That the engineer in the office has more to offer than the technician on the floor." She paused. "That assumption cost companies everything. It cost us 61 hours and nearly cost us a $140 million contract. We got lucky. I don't intend to rely on luck again." She set down her notes entirely and looked at the room with the directness of someone no longer reading from anything. What I want you to understand is this. What happened with the Series 7 was not a one-time exception. It was evidence of a pattern. There are people in this building, in this room, who know things that this company is not organized to hear. You've been trying to tell us in maintenance logs, in break room conversations, in things you've noticed on the floor that didn't fit anywhere in our official processes. Some of those things matter enormously, and we've been missing them. She paused. That changes today. Not with a speech, with a system. She outlined the policy. The cross-functional technical input program. She'd finally given it a better name, something Ron had suggested. The Floor Knowledge Initiative, which was plain and accurate and had no corporate language in it. Every employee, regardless of role or title, would have a formal pathway to submit technical observations about equipment, processes, or operational patterns. Submissions would be reviewed by a joint team of engineering and operations staff. Credible contributions would be documented, attributed, and acted on. The person who flagged a problem would be told what happened with their flag, which was the part most systems forgot and which rendered every other part useless. This isn't a suggestion box, she said. A suggestion box is where ideas go to be ignored politely. This is a documentation system with accountability and follow-through, and I will personally review its outputs every quarter. She paused. I also want to be honest about something harder. A system like this only works if the people in positions of authority are willing to listen, genuinely listen, not perform listening, to people they might previously have dismissed. That is a cultural change, not a procedural one, and cultural changes are slower and harder and more uncomfortable than procedural ones. She looked at Derek, who was still looking at the table. Some of you in leadership and engineering roles are going to have to sit with the discomfort of receiving a useful insight from someone whose job description doesn't include insight. I'm asking you to do that. I'm also asking you to think about how many times you might have passed that person in a hallway and not thought to ask what they knew. The room was quiet enough that she could hear the ambient sound of the factory floor through the walls, the machines running, the particular rhythm of Hartwell in operation. One more thing, she said, and then I'll stop, because I've already used more of your time than I planned. She looked at the back of the room. Caleb, she said, I know you didn't want this. I know you came in this morning expecting to spend your shift doing what you always do, and instead you've spent 20 minutes being talked about in front of a large group of people, which I suspect is approximately your idea of a difficult morning. She saw something in his face shift, very slightly. Not quite a smile, not quite the absence of one. But I needed to say what I said, and I needed to say it with you in the room because you deserve to hear it directly. Not in a memo. Not through someone else. From me, in front of the company that almost missed you. She let that land. Thank you, she said, for 5 minutes that you almost didn't get. For 4 years of work that we weren't reading correctly. For a standard of care for these machines that has kept this floor running better than it knew it was running. She paused. And for the patience to keep showing up to a place that hadn't figured out yet what it had. The applause started before she finished the sentence. Not polite applause, not the reflexive clapping of an audience completing a social obligation. The real kind. The kind that comes from a room full of people who have been holding something they recognized and are now being told it was worth holding. The maintenance crew clapped longest, which Ava had not planned for, and which caught in her chest in a way she hadn't expected. Marcus Webb stood up. He was 56 years old and had been on this floor longer than anyone except Ron Stiles, and he stood up without apparent self-consciousness and started clapping. And when Marcus Webb stood up, 4 other people stood up, and then the room was standing, which was not something that happened at Hartwell all-hands meetings, and which was not something Ava had in any way arranged. She looked at Caleb. He was standing with his arms at his sides, looking at the room around him with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not the careful stillness, not the patient attention he brought to machines and conversations alike. Something more exposed than that, and more complicated. The expression of a person who had spent years making themselves small enough to fit into a life that could hold them, and who was standing in a room that was suddenly, loudly insisting that they were larger than that, and who was not entirely sure what to do with the insistence. He did not look comfortable, but he didn't look away either. After a moment he nodded. One clean, deliberate movement of his head. The nod she'd come to recognize as his version of the full range of formal acknowledgement he was willing to provide. It was, she thought, completely him, and therefore exactly right. The room settled. People filed out. Work continued, because work at a factory continues, which is its own form of tribute to the machines and the people who keep them. Derek found Caleb by the coffee station, which Derek told Ava about later, and which she thought was the detail of the morning that mattered as much as anything she'd said at the front of the room. "I owe you a better apology than the one I gave you before," Derek said. Caleb looked at him. "You apologized." "I apologized for laughing. I didn't apologize for—" Derek paused, working through it. "For the years before the laugh. For 4 years of walking past you on this floor and never thinking to ask what you knew." He stopped. "I'm sorry for that." Caleb was quiet for a moment. He poured coffee into a mug, his own mug, from the cabinet, not the communal stack, and said, "You're asking good questions now. Because of you." "No." Caleb looked at him. "Because you're capable of it. I just gave you a reason to start." He paused. "Don't give me credit for something you did." Derek absorbed that. "It was," he told Ava later, "the most useful thing anyone had said to him in years. Not because it was kind, but because it was accurate, and it removed the distance of gratitude and put the responsibility back where it belonged, which was with Derek, which was where it needed to be if anything was going to be different going forward." "The load distribution problem," Derek said. "On the 7, the adjustment I implemented from your email, it's holding?" "Perfectly. I want to understand how you reasoned through it. Not just the answer, the reasoning." Caleb looked at him for a moment, and something in his posture suggested this was a different kind of request than the ones that had come before. Not the request for a solution, but the request to understand the mind behind it. He said, "Come find me on the floor tonight if you can. I'll walk you through it on the machine. It's easier to explain on the machine than in an email." Derek said he would. He did. He showed up at 11 p.m. in civilian clothes, which was slightly unusual, and spent 2 hours on the floor with Caleb walking through the load distribution architecture in a way that no training program or engineering manual had ever made legible to him. He told Ava the next morning that he'd learned more in those 2 hours than in the last 6 months of standard professional development activities, which was either a compliment to Caleb or an indictment of standard professional development activities, and was probably both. The months that followed were not a transformation. Ava was honest with herself about that, because she'd seen enough organizational announcements of transformation to know that the word usually meant someone had updated the company values poster and held a workshop. What happened at Hartwell was smaller and more durable than transformation. It was a gradual shift in how people talk to each other, which is the only way cultures actually change. The Floor Knowledge Initiative launched in December and had, in its first 3 months, received 47 submissions from employees across 11 departments. 12 of those submissions had been flagged as technically significant by the review team. Of those 12, 7 had been acted on. 3 of the 7 had prevented equipment issues before they became failures. 1 had identified a process inefficiency in the quality control sequence that reduced material waste by a margin that, annualized, saved the company roughly $80,000. The submission that identified the quality control inefficiency came from a line operator named Jerry Stafford, who had been at Hartwell for 9 years, and who had noticed the pattern 6 years ago and never had anywhere to put the observation. When the review team came back to him with confirmation that his observation was correct and the change had been implemented, he stood in the middle of the production floor and was quiet for a moment in a way that several people noticed. Then he said, to no one in particular, "I thought I was probably wrong." He hadn't been wrong. He'd just been somewhere the question couldn't reach him until now. Ava read about Jerry Stafford in the initiative's first quarterly report, which she reviewed personally, as promised. She sat with it for a long time, 6 years. He'd known something for 6 years that the company needed to know, and the gap between what he knew and what the company received wasn't ignorance or laziness or failure of communication, it was architecture. It was the simple, silent architecture of a system that had only built doors and certain walls and called that listening. She thought about how many Jerrys were in every building she'd ever worked in, how many maintenance logs nobody had read for content, how many break room conversations that contained the answer to a problem someone in an office was paying a consultant to solve. She put that thought in the quarterly address she gave in February, which was shorter and less dramatic than the November one, but which she thought might have mattered more, because February's address was about the ongoing work rather than the catalyzing moment, and the ongoing work was where things either held or didn't. Caleb was not at the February address. He was on nights, and Ava had not asked him to rearrange his schedule for it, because that would have been the wrong call. She sent him the transcript the next morning with a one-line note, for what it's worth. He responded 4 hours later, which meant he'd read it after picking up Lily and before going to sleep. It's worth something. 3 words, which from him was expansive. Lily turned 8 in February. Caleb mentioned it in passing during one of the floor conversations that had become a regular, unscheduled thing. Ava walking the night shift, Caleb on his rounds, the two of them talking at the margins of the work, in the way that people talk when they've found they have things to say to each other that don't fit the formal channels. She asked what Lily wanted for her birthday. He said she'd asked for a telescope because she'd become interested in stars, which had started with a school project and had metastasized into an obsession that now required library books and a star chart taped above her bed. She wants to know how things work, Ava said. Yeah, he said, with the particular tone of a father who recognizes himself in his child and finds it both gratifying and slightly alarming. She takes things apart to see the parts. Last month it was the kitchen timer. Did it survive? She put it back together. It runs about 40 seconds fast now. He paused. Which is still pretty good for a 7-year-old. Ava laughed. The same surprised, real laugh she'd produced in the hydraulic equipment room months ago. Did you help her? I watched. He glanced over. She didn't ask for help. I figured she'd ask if she needed it. Ava thought about that. The restraint of it. The specific, deliberate choice to let someone do a thing themselves rather than doing it better for them. She thought about it in the context of how he'd managed the engineering team, too. He'd never delivered answers without being asked. He'd responded to questions with questions as often as explanations, nudging Priya and Derek toward the reasoning rather than handing them conclusions, which made the process slower and the understanding permanent. You teach the same way you parent, she said. He considered this. Maybe, he said. I think, if you give someone the answer, they have one answer. If you give them the path to the answer, they have a method. He paused. A method works on more than one problem. She thought about that for several days. In March, James Sterling came back to the factory for the first time in 8 months. He came quietly, the way he did most things, on a Tuesday morning, without announcement, moving through the floor with the ease of a man who had spent 30 years in the space and still knew where everything lived. His health had stabilized. I was 61, thinner than he'd been, moving more carefully, but present in the full sense of the word. Ava walked the floor with him. They didn't talk much. They'd always been better at silence together than most parents and children, which was one of the things she'd always been grateful for. He looked at the machines with the affectionate attention of someone visiting old friends. He ran his hand along the Series 7's housing the way she'd seen Caleb do it, and the similarity struck her with the sideways force of an observation she hadn't been expecting. She sounds good, he said. She does, Ava said. He looked at her. I read the address, the November one. She waited. Your grandfather used to say, he stopped. He used to say that the floor knows more than the office. I said it to you when you were coming up. Did I say it? You said it, she said. I thought I understood what it meant. I didn't, fully. He nodded slowly. You do now. Getting there. He looked at the Series 7 for a moment. Tell me about the man who fixed it. She told him. Not the edited version, not the organizational narrative, the actual version, starting from the night the machine stopped and ending at the February address and Lily's kitchen timer. He listened the way he always listened, which was without interruption, which had been one of the most important things he'd ever modeled for her without calling it a lesson. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. You almost sent him away, he said. Yes. But you didn't. No. He looked at her with the particular expression of a parent who is watching a child do something difficult correctly and is trying to communicate both the difficulty and the correctness without diminishing either. That's the hardest one, he said, knowing when you're about to make the wrong call and stopping yourself. He paused. Most people aren't watching themselves closely enough to catch it. I nearly wasn't, she said. But you were, he said, and then you built the system so the next person doesn't have to rely on nearly. She thought about Jerry Stafford, who'd known something for 6 years. Working on it, she said. He put his hand briefly on her shoulder, a gesture he used rarely and therefore precisely, and then moved on down the floor, reacquainting himself with the machines he'd spent 30 years building a company around. She watched him go and thought about the things that get passed down, not the titles or the assets or the formal inheritances, but the quieter things. How to walk a floor, how to listen to a room, how to stop yourself at the edge of the wrong call and choose differently. She was still learning all of it. She expected she'd be learning it for a long time. The last conversation she had with Caleb that felt like a conclusion, though not like an ending, because the work continued and the floor kept running and Lily's telescope arrived on a Friday and immediately revealed, Caleb reported the following Monday, that the moon had more detail on its surface than Lily had expected, which had led to 40 minutes of questions he'd done his best to answer, and some he'd had to look up, which Lily had found instructive and Caleb had found genuinely enjoyable, happened in April, on a slow night when the production floor was at reduced capacity and the building had the particular quality of quiet that it reached in the deep hours. He was at the Series 7. He often ended up there, she'd noticed, not working on it, not monitoring it, just present near it, the way people are present near something they understand and find some form of comfort in the understanding of. She was leaving late, coat on, and stopped at the edge of the production floor. "You could be anywhere," she said. He looked over. "I mean that factually," she said. "The patents are still generating income. You have an engineering reputation. People in the industry know your name, even if you didn't know they did. If you wanted to go back to the kind of work you were doing before, I know," he said. "I'm not trying to push you toward anything," she said. "I just want to know, honestly, is this where you want to be?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at the Series 7. The machine ran in its steady rhythm, titanium components cycling through the precision sequence, the production log accumulating its record of an ordinary, excellent night of manufacture. "Before Claire died," he said, "I wanted a lot of things, career things. I wanted to publish more, present at the conference I turned down, build something that would be around after I was gone." He paused. "I still want some of those things. In the abstract way you want things you've put down. But what I actually need, what makes sense when I think about the next 10 years and what I want them to be, is this. A job that I understand completely, that I can do well and go home from, that keeps me here when Lily's here." He looked at the machine. "And one machine that's interesting enough to keep me from getting bored." "Just the one?" The corner of his mouth moved. "The 7's enough." She smiled. "And the advisory work? The engineering questions?" "I like those," he said, and it was unambiguous. "Derek comes down on Tuesdays now. Priya sends me questions. There's a junior technician named Dario who's going to be very good in a few years. I've been working with him when I can." He paused. That part didn't feel like giving something up. That felt like finding somewhere useful to put something I still had. She thought about what he'd said months ago in the equipment room. The machine wasn't telling the software anything was wrong, but machines still talk, just differently. She'd thought about that sentence more than almost anything else in the past 5 months, about what it meant to listen in the register that things were actually speaking in rather than the register you'd built your instruments to hear. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure." "The night the machine went down, when you first came over and put your hand on the housing, what were you actually feeling for? What were you listening to?" He thought about it. Not the way he thought about technical questions. This was slower, more interior. "I was listening for the shape of the silence," he said. "Every machine has a residual pattern, even when it's not running. Temperature distribution, micro-vibration from the building, the way the metal settles. The 7's pattern was off. Not dramatically, subtly. But I knew it's normal, so I knew what wasn't normal." "You knew it's normal," she repeated. 4 years. She stood there for a moment, listening to the machine herself. She couldn't hear what he heard. Not yet. Maybe someday. Probably not. But she could hear more than she'd heard in October, which was something. "That's what we've been trying to build," she said. "The initiative, the engineering collaboration, all of it. We're trying to build an organization that knows its own normal well enough to hear when something's off." "Yeah," he said. "That's what you're building." She looked at him. "Is it working?" He considered the question with the honesty he brought to all questions, which meant he didn't answer immediately. "It's working in the places where people are willing to listen," he said, which is most places, when you make it possible. A pause. You made it possible. That's not nothing. It wasn't nothing. She knew that. She also knew it wasn't finished and wouldn't be finished because that kind of work doesn't finish. It just continues at different stages with different people doing their parts. Jerry Stafford, with his 6 years of observation and his kitchen timer comment. Dario, who would be very good in a few years. Derek on Tuesdays. Priya's email questions at 3 a.m., which Caleb answered at the same hour because that was when he was on the floor and his thinking was clear. She put her coat on properly, adjusted the collar, looked at the production floor one more time. 340 people who came to this building every day or every night and knew things that the building needed to know, and a system that was slowly learning how to listen. Good night, Caleb, she said. Good night, Ava. He said her name without the hesitation it used to carry. The old habit had dissolved somewhere in the past months, replaced by something more plain and mutual. She walked out through the main doors and into the April air, which was cold still, but with the hint in it of something else. The season turning, the long Midwest winter finally reconsidering itself. The parking lot was mostly empty. Her car was one of 4 left in the lot, which meant she'd stayed late again, which was becoming less of a crisis management habit and more of a genuine choice, not driven by anxiety, but by the simple fact that she found the building interesting at night. Her father had walked the floor every morning. She was learning to walk it at midnight. Different hours, same lesson, taught to her in the end not by a business school or a mentor or a carefully constructed leadership curriculum, but by a man in a maintenance uniform with grease under his fingernails and a daughter who could reassemble a kitchen timer and a mind that understood machines well enough to hear the shape of their silence. She drove home through the empty streets and thought about how many people she'd passed in her life, how many hallways, how many break rooms, how many overlooked moments, carrying something she'd needed and never thought to ask for. She didn't know the exact number. It was more than she wanted it to be, but she was asking now. That was where it started. That was where it always started. Not with the dramatic recognition, not with the speech in front of the company, not with the contract or the machine coming back to life on the factory floor. It started with one person stopping long enough to say, "Can I take a look?" And another person, for reasons that were partly judgment and partly chance and partly something neither of them could name, saying, "Yes." Everything else was what you built from that.